It began in the ruins of a dream. Banks closing, farms silent, a nation built on credit and shame. Out of that silence walked a man who refused to kneel. John Dillinger didn't invent rebellion. He just gave it a face America could understand. He learned discipline in a prison built to break it, studied freedom like others studied scripture, and turned every lesson into a weapon. When the country lost faith in its banks, he robbed them. When the law built walls, he learned how to walk through them. Every escape was a blueprint, every mistake, a lesson the Bureau would use to build itself. Behind him came the machine, J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Investigation, desperate for legitimacy, chasing not just a criminal, but a symbol it couldn't control. Each side needed the other to exist. Dillinger's defiance gave the Bureau its purpose. The Bureau's pursuit made him immortal. He wasn't fighting for money, he was fighting gravity, the invisible force that keeps ordinary men obedient. For a year he made the nation believe one man could outrun the system, until the system learned to run faster. A theater marquee, a woman in an orange dress, a city holding its breath, and a single moment when America stopped asking who was right, only who would shoot first. In the summer of 1903, on the quiet southern edge of Indianapolis, a child was born into an ordinary American household that would one day become a symbol of rebellion against order itself. His name was John Herbert Dillinger, the son of a grocer, whose life was defined by steady labor and rigid expectations. The family lived in the modest Oak Hill district, where the rhythm of life moved with the hum of streetcars and the creak of wooden porches. John's early years were unremarkable, but beneath that stillness, a restlessness began to stir. His mother, Molly, died before he turned 4, leaving behind a void that discipline could not fill. His father, stern and moral, tried to contain him through alternating bursts of severity and leniency, creating a home that oscillated between punishment and forgiveness. The boy who grew in that uneasy balance was curious, impulsive, and bright enough to know how to hide it. He found comfort, not in study, but in motion, running through backyards, testing limits, disobeying rules that seemed arbitrary, in a world already ruled by adults. When his father remarried, John's resentment deepened. The woman who entered the house was kind but foreign to him, and the young boy withdrew further into mischief. He skipped school, roamed streets, and began collecting minor offenses that marked the beginning of a pattern. Teachers noted intelligence, mixed with defiance. His father saw laziness, though what truly burned inside was boredom, the silent enemy of restless men. By his mid-teens, Dillinger abandoned the pretense of school altogether. He took a job at a machine shop in Indianapolis, operating heavy equipment with a quick hand and a sharper eye. Those who worked beside him found him skilled but easily distracted, a young man who performed well when the work demanded strength, but drifted whenever repetition dulled his mind. He stayed out late, gambling, drinking, testing boundaries. His father saw corruption closing in and decided to act. He sold his grocery business, packed the family's possessions, and moved them to a farm in Mooresville, Indiana. There, among open fields and silent dawns, he hoped to discipline his son through isolation and labor. But the countryside only amplified John's rebellion. He worked the fields with resentment, sneaking away to town whenever he could. Life on the farm brought no peace, only monotony. When his father attempted to correct him through strict punishment, John responded with distance, and soon with defiance. He spent his nights wandering Mooresville's quiet streets, mixing with drifters and small-time hustlers. An argument with his father fractured what little bond remained. The rift grew until John fled the farm entirely, wandering between jobs and short stints in Indianapolis, before eventually facing the law for auto theft, his first serious offense. The court spared him jail time on account of his age, but humiliation stung deeper than punishment. Seeking escape, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, hoping to find structure or purpose. The attempt lasted only months. His rebellious nature clashed with military life. He went absent without leave, deserted, and vanished back into civilian obscurity. The act branded him a deserter, adding shame to his growing list of failures. Back in Indiana, the 21-year-old Dillinger met Beryl Hovius, a 16-year-old girl who saw in him the charm and confidence that others mistook for arrogance. They married quickly in 1924, full of plans they could not afford. Their new life began in Indianapolis, but work was scarce, and ambition was blind. The economy offered little for a man without patience, and John drifted again, chasing schemes whispered in pool halls and back rooms. He fell under the influence of Ed Singleton, a local pool shark who shared his thirst for easy money. Together, they plotted a crude robbery of a local grocer, an amateur crime doomed before it began. The plan unraveled instantly. Singleton was caught and tried, receiving 2 years in prison. Dillinger, on his father's advice, confessed, believing honesty might earn mercy. Instead, it earned him a sentence of 2 to 14 years for assault and battery, with intent to rob, and 10 to 20 years for conspiracy to commit a felony. The combined penalty condemned him to Indiana State Prison, a place that would turn him from reckless youth into deliberate criminal. Prison life stripped away illusions. The steel bars, the echoing halls, the endless regimentation, all fed a growing bitterness inside him. Dillinger was stunned by the length of his sentence, a punishment disproportionate to the failed crime that harmed no one. He withdrew from optimism, reshaping his frustration into calculation. Over the next 8 years, the man who had once chased petty thrills learned patience from the most dangerous mentors the state could offer. Inside, he met hardened criminals: Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, Charles Mackley, and others, men whose experience in robbery, escape, and violence dwarfed his own. Dillinger's intelligence flourished in confinement. He mastered discipline, control, and observation. What began as resentment evolved into resolve. He became the student of a new profession: organized crime. The young man who entered as an impulsive offender left prison in 1933 as a strategist. He learned the anatomy of banks, the psychology of fear, the timing of an ambush, and the unspoken hierarchy of loyalty among thieves. Each passing year hardened him further. By the time he was paroled, his smile was cold and his patience dangerous. The bitterness of his sentence had fused with purpose. When he walked out of Indiana State Prison on May 10, 1933, he had served 8.5 years. The America he stepped into was not the one he had left. The Great Depression had hollowed towns across the Midwest. Bread lines wound down city blocks, and unemployed men drifted between failed farms and shuttered factories. Banks were the symbols of betrayal, the face of a system that had stolen hope from ordinary citizens. Within that climate, a man who took from banks could be mistaken for a folk hero. Dillinger understood this instinctively. He returned to Mooresville briefly, to a home he no longer recognized. The family farm still stood, but years of separation had turned affection into unease. His father saw a stranger, his stepmother a shadow of the restless boy she once tried to reach. Dillinger stayed only long enough to plan his next move. Parole conditions forbade him from leaving the state, but he had no intention of living by the state's laws anymore. His first act of defiance came swiftly. Within weeks of release, he assembled a small crew and robbed the Bluffton Bank in Ohio, escaping with thousands of dollars. It was the act of a man testing his skill, confirming what prison had taught him. The robbery was clean, quick, and professional. The money meant little compared to the thrill of precision, the proof that he could outthink the law. But his success drew attention. Local authorities, spurred by the growing network of state and federal communication, traced his movements across counties. On September 22, 1933, police in Dayton, Ohio, arrested Dillinger. He was lodged in the Allen County Jail in Lima, awaiting trial for robbery. During booking, officers discovered a folded document in his pocket, detailed blueprints for a prison escape plan. He denied knowledge of it, claiming it belonged to someone else, but the evidence marked him as more than a common thief. What the police did not know was that 8 of Dillinger's friends were still inside Indiana State Prison, including the men he had learned from. They recognized in him their best chance at freedom. 4 days after his arrest, the plan found in his possession came to life. The Indiana State Prison breakout of October 1933 shocked the Midwest. Armed with smuggled shotguns and rifles, 8 convicts stormed the prison yard, killing 2 guards and escaping into the countryside. Among them were Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark, the mentors who had shaped Dillinger's criminal education. The timing was no coincidence. Days later, 3 of the escaped men, joined by an accomplice on parole, appeared at the Lima jail, posing as state officers, sent to transfer Dillinger back to Indiana. The sheriff, suspicious, asked for identification. One of the imposters drew a pistol and fired, killing him instantly. They seized the keys, freed Dillinger, locked the sheriff's wife and deputy in a cell, and vanished. The murder of the sheriff placed Dillinger at the center of national outrage. Though he had not fired the weapon, his name was tied to the act, his legend sealed by blood. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, still known then as the Bureau of Investigation, was asked to assist in identifying the fugitives. Their fingerprint files were marked with red metal tags, a signal for wanted men. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover, newly empowered to modernize federal policing, saw in this crime a test case for his vision of national law enforcement. The Bureau began compiling information, connecting state crimes into a pattern that crossed jurisdictions, a step toward the future of federal pursuit. Meanwhile, Dillinger and his companions vanished into the Midwest. Over the next 2 months, they robbed banks across Indiana and Ohio, each heist bolder than the last. They raided police arsenals in Auburn and Peru, stealing machine guns, rifles, revolvers, and bulletproof vests. Their firepower rivaled that of small armies. By late 1933, the gang had killed multiple officers and civilians. Each success deepened their notoriety, and the press, eager for stories of defiance in hard times, transformed their crimes into headlines. To the public, Dillinger was both villain and symbol. A man who took from institutions despised by millions. In the quiet spaces between robberies, Dillinger refined his methods. He demanded efficiency, discipline, and precision. The influence of his prison mentors was visible in every operation. The quick entry, the clean getaway, the coordination of cars and lookouts. His mind operated like a clock under pressure, turning lawlessness into routine. But every successful escape planted the seeds of overconfidence. As the winter of 1933 set in, his circle grew restless. The law was tightening around them. Small towns no longer offered safety, and betrayal lurked within every rented room. Still, Dillinger showed little fear. His notoriety fed him. The cameras that captured his face in wanted posters only amplified the myth he had become. Newspapers printed his image, beside words like public enemy. For a public weary of hopelessness, his name carried a strange electricity. For law enforcement, it was an open challenge. By the dawn of 1934, Dillinger had robbed more than a dozen banks, outmaneuvered police in multiple states, and armed himself beyond the reach of local departments. Yet he had also left a trail of bodies and broken alliances. The country's fascination with his defiance could not erase the violence of his record. His reputation was about to collide with a new, disciplined enemy, one that would not be bribed, outgunned, or humiliated. When he was finally captured in Tucson, Arizona, after a fire exposed his hideout, the world saw the full transformation. The young mechanic from Indianapolis, once sentenced for a failed grocery theft, now faced charges of murder, armed robbery, and conspiracy. In less than a year, he had become the face of America's war on crime. Yet even in custody, his calm expression unnerved guards and reporters alike. His mind was already elsewhere, calculating, planning, waiting. The Great Depression had produced outlaws who mirrored the chaos of their age, but none matched Dillinger's mix of intellect, composure, and audacity. He belonged to a generation of criminals who treated robbery as an operation, not an impulse. His rise from petty delinquent to organized fugitive embodied the shift from local lawlessness to national threat. When the prison gates of Crown Point closed behind him in early 1934, officials believed they had finally caged the Midwest's most dangerous man. They did not yet understand who they were dealing with. Dillinger had spent 8 years studying confinement and 8 months mastering escape. The system that built its confidence on iron bars and concrete walls was about to meet a man who saw both as temporary obstacles. His next move would not only humiliate state authorities, but also trigger a federal pursuit that would define an era. As winter gave way to spring, and as Washington's Bureau of Investigation expanded its power under Hoover's command, a new kind of conflict was taking shape, one between the outlaw and the institution, the man of motion and the machinery of law. The chase that would follow would transform both sides forever. The world knew him now as a gangster. The Bureau knew him as public enemy number one. But to himself, John Herbert Dillinger was something else entirely. A man convinced that freedom could still be stolen if one moved fast enough. And on the day he would next escape, he would learn how wrong, and how briefly, such freedom could last. If you want, I can now combine all 4 passages you've given me and split the complete story into clean chunks of roughly 1,900 to 2,000 characters each, keeping paragraph integrity. This would make it ready for serialization or publication. The gates of Indiana State Prison closed behind him on a warm day in May 1933. And John Dillinger stepped into a country he no longer recognized. The years inside had stripped him of youth and naivety, leaving a man both hardened and deliberate. 8.5 years in confinement had erased the rhythms of ordinary life. Even the sky looked wider, the air heavier. Around him, America was staggering. The Great Depression had deepened into its 4th year, grinding down families, farms, and entire towns. Men who once worked in factories now stood in bread lines. Banks foreclosed on homes faster than they could be built. Against that backdrop, Dillinger's release felt less like freedom and more like an opportunity disguised as exile. He had entered prison as an impulsive drifter who robbed a grocer for pocket money. He emerged with the education of a criminal strategist, a man who viewed the world in patterns of weakness and opportunity. His former cellmates, Pierpont, Makeley, Clark, and Hamilton, remained locked inside. But their ideas traveled with him. They had taught him everything from the mechanics of safe cracking to the logistics of escape routes and the art of disguise. They had spoken often of the Midwest's banks, small, underguarded, and swollen with cash, despite the nation's hardship. The parole board expected Dillinger to return quietly to Mooresville, his family's farm town south of Indianapolis. He did return, for a time. His father greeted him cautiously, torn between pride and suspicion. The local community viewed the young man as an object of curiosity, half success story, half cautionary tale. He worked briefly on the family property, but the routine of farm life felt intolerable. He had spent nearly a decade memorizing details of men, locks, and escapes. Now he was expected to till soil and mend fences. The tension grew quickly. He had no intention of obeying parole conditions that confined him to a single county. Within weeks, Dillinger was gone. He drifted across the state, moving through small towns where cash still flowed through banks that hadn't yet collapsed. His first robbery, in Bluffton, Ohio, was quick and controlled. Enter. Secure the money. Exit before the first alarm sounded. Witnesses recalled confidence, rather than chaos. He fled with several $1,000s, enough to sustain his travels, and test the lessons he had absorbed in prison. The money was divided among accomplices, but Dillinger's true reward was precision. For the first time, he had executed a crime that matched his ambition. In the press, the story barely registered. Bank robberies had become commonplace across the Midwest, each blending into the next. Yet the scale of organization hinted at something larger. Within law enforcement circles, a new name began circulating in reports, attached to multiple incidents across Indiana and Ohio. The name was not yet infamous, but it would soon dominate front pages from Chicago to St. Louis. The weeks following the Bluffton heist brought more attempts, each carefully chosen for vulnerability, each more ambitious than the last. Dillinger's approach was methodical. Gather intelligence from locals, study guard schedules, rehearse entry and exit routes. He treated every robbery as a problem to be solved. While other criminals relied on brute force or chaos, he favored discipline and planning. That difference would soon draw the attention of state authorities, and eventually, the federal government itself. But the illusion of control did not last. On September 22, 1933, while visiting Dayton, Ohio, Dillinger was captured by local police. The arrest was quiet, professional, and unremarkable. No gunfire, no resistance. He was taken to the Allen County Jail in Lima, booked under armed robbery charges, and placed in a cell to await trial. The process should have been routine, but what the officers found during the search transformed a simple case into a federal spectacle. Folded in Dillinger's pocket was a detailed document, hand-drawn maps, guard schedules, and escape timing charts. The officers had stumbled upon plans for a prison break. When questioned, Dillinger denied any connection to the papers, claiming ignorance. The police remained unconvinced, but had no proof of conspiracy beyond possession. The documents were filed as evidence, and Dillinger was locked away in a small cell, guarded by the local sheriff. The sheriff, Jess Sarber, was a respected lawman, known for caution rather than recklessness. He had seen his share of criminals but treated Dillinger as a minor nuisance, unaware that outside the walls of his jail, events were already in motion that would turn the case into national news. 4 days later, the plan discovered in Dillinger's pocket unfolded inside the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City, using smuggled shotguns and rifles. 8 inmates, including Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and Harry Copeland, executed a violent breakout. They shot 2 guards and fled into the Indiana countryside. Before authorities could react, the escape shocked the state. The fugitives vanished quickly, aided by sympathizers and criminal networks developed over years. Police departments across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio exchanged frantic telegrams describing armed convicts on the loose. None suspected that their next move would target the small jail in Lima. By October 12th, the fugitives had regrouped under Pierpont's leadership. They needed manpower and money. But above all, they wanted to free Dillinger, the man who had once smuggled weapons into their prison, and who by virtue of his outside freedom had helped enable their own escape. Loyalty demanded repayment. They drove to Lima in a stolen car, dressed in suits and carrying forged credentials. At the jail, the sheriff received them cautiously. He asked for identification. The lead man reached into his coat, drew a pistol, and shot him point blank. The others subdued the deputies, seized the jail keys, and opened Dillinger's cell. The operation lasted minutes. Dillinger walked out alive, while the sheriff lay dying on the floor. The escape marked the turning point. What had begun as a string of regional robberies became a case of murder and organized conspiracy. Newspapers across the Midwest carried the story. The Chicago Tribune, the Indianapolis Star, and others splashed Dillinger's name across front pages, portraying him as both ruthless and cunning. For the first time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, then still the Bureau of Investigation, was asked to assist. Local law enforcement lacked the resources to track a mobile, heavily armed gang operating across multiple states. The Bureau's Identification Division flagged the fugitives' fingerprint cards with red metal tags, marking them as top priority targets. The country that had ignored Dillinger's first crimes now followed his every move. Reporters began crafting his image. A man who robbed banks with precision, who seemed to appear and vanish at will. To a nation beaten down by economic despair, his defiance carried a strange allure. In the public imagination, he became part rebel, part folk hero. Though the reality was darker, behind the headlines were dead lawmen, stolen weapons, and an organization armed to military standards. In the weeks following his escape, Dillinger moved constantly. He joined Pierpont's crew, which now included Copeland, Hamilton, and Mackley. They traveled through small Midwestern towns, robbing banks with methodical precision. Each robbery followed the same blueprint: enter fast, control the crowd, seize the cash, and disappear before authorities could respond. The gang's discipline and coordination distinguished them from the chaotic bandits of earlier years. They carried Thompson submachine guns, Winchester rifles, and bulletproof vests, stolen from police armories. They were no longer improvising. They were operating like a paramilitary force. Their most audacious acts involved raiding police arsenals. In Auburn, Indiana, and later in Peru, they overpowered guards, emptied weapon lockers, and escaped with machine guns and ammunition. Law enforcement agencies were humiliated. Armed robberies were one thing. Attacking police departments directly was another. The raids fueled Dillinger's growing legend and solidified the gang's position as the most dangerous criminal outfit in the Midwest. Every success widened the net around them. State police, federal agents, and private detectives began exchanging information across jurisdictional lines, a practice still new at the time. The Bureau's field offices compiled witness accounts and license plate records, building what would become one of the first multi-state criminal profiles in modern law enforcement history. By December 1933, Dillinger's name was known in every newsroom and police station in the country. He had become the face of a new kind of American criminal, organized, intelligent, and fearless. Yet within the gang, cracks began to form. The men who had once shared prison camaraderie now wrestled with exhaustion, paranoia, and the constant threat of betrayal. They changed hideouts weekly, sleeping in abandoned farmhouses or rented rooms under false names. Each morning, Dillinger checked newspapers for reports of sightings, measuring how far behind the law had fallen. Despite growing tension, the gang's operations continued. The final months of 1933 saw several major robberies across Indiana and Ohio, each more violent than the last. During one in East Chicago, a police officer was shot and killed. The act transformed Dillinger from a notorious outlaw into a murderer in the eyes of the public. Whether he pulled the trigger himself mattered little. The line between myth and reality had already blurred. By early 1934, the toll was evident. The gang's luck was beginning to fray. Every success tightened the noose around them. Rewards grew, tip lines multiplied, and a new kind of pursuit was forming, one that combined local vigilance with federal coordination. The Bureau, learning from earlier failures, began tracking Dillinger's pattern of movement through banking records, vehicle registrations, and fingerprints. For the first time, a criminal was being hunted not only by men with guns, but by data. The winter wind across the Midwest carried two stories, one of admiration and one of fear. Some saw Dillinger as an avenger against corrupt institutions. Others saw him as proof that the country's moral order had collapsed. The truth was simpler. He was a man who had learned how to exploit the cracks in a broken system, swiftly, intelligently, and without hesitation. The escape from Lima had done more than free a prisoner. It had announced the beginning of an era. In a matter of months, Dillinger's actions forced the modernization of American law enforcement, pushing the Bureau to expand its authority beyond state borders. Each robbery, each killing, each narrow escape became a catalyst for federal reform. The nation was learning that crime could move faster than jurisdiction. By the close of 1933, Dillinger's course was set. His gang was armed, organized, and growing bolder, but the circle around them was shrinking. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, now with legal power under the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, was preparing to intervene. Dillinger's next arrest would trigger a chain of events that would carry him from the deserts of Arizona to the alleys of Chicago. In the fading light of that winter, the man who had walked out of prison 7 months earlier was no longer a parolee searching for freedom. He had become a fugitive, chasing a vision of control that could not last. Every robbery, every headline, Every bullet spent was leading toward a single collision between a man who believed he could outrun the law and an institution determined to prove otherwise. The following year would end with gunfire outside a Chicago theater, but in these months, the transformation was complete. The parolee had become the hunted. The name John Dillinger would no longer belong to a man, but to an era, the first true public enemy #1. The murder of Sheriff Jess Sarber at the Lima jail shattered any illusion that John Dillinger's story was one of minor rebellion. The act transformed him overnight from fugitive to national menace. As the body of the sheriff was carried out beneath a gray Ohio sky, newspapers printed his name in bold type. Across the Midwest, police departments doubled their patrols, and state lines no longer meant safety. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover took notice, though the Bureau of Investigation had limited authority. The Lima jailbreak offered an opportunity to expand it. Dillinger's case would become the first to test the Bureau's growing capacity for interstate pursuit. For Dillinger himself, freedom had a new price. He owed it to the men who had risked their lives to free him. Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, Harry Copeland, and John Hamilton. They were no longer a collection of escapees. They were a unit forged by prison years, bound by loyalty and necessity. They needed money, weapons, and mobility. In the waning days of autumn 1933, they set out to acquire all three. Their first move was practical. They traveled through Indiana and Illinois, moving from farmhouse to farmhouse, stealing food and gasoline from barns, sleeping in abandoned buildings when they could not afford hotels. The group's cohesion came from discipline. Pierpont, older and methodical, acted as strategist. Dillinger, younger and impulsive, handled logistics. Mackley and Clark served as muscle, while Copeland and Hamilton scouted routes. Together they mapped the contours of their new life, an existence measured in stolen hours and silent roads. By late October, they struck their first target as a team, the Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana. The robbery lasted barely 3 minutes. The gang moved with practiced synchronization, cutting through the small-town routine like a military drill. Dillinger stood at the entrance, commanding the space through presence alone, while the others collected cash from tellers and customers. No shots were fired. When they left, the bank's clock still read the hour of their arrival. The stolen amount, over $70,000, was enough to fund their next stage. They drove south in a convoy of stolen cars, hiding in wooded areas during daylight and traveling at night. Newspapers began linking scattered robberies across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois to the same crew. The pattern was clear: quick assaults, minimal violence, and uncanny coordination. The public followed each headline with morbid fascination. The men's faces, often blurred in newspaper photos, became symbols of defiance in a nation where most people felt powerless. To many, Dillinger's precision represented control in an era of collapse. To law enforcement, it represented war. Their next priority was weaponry. The gang needed to outgun any resistance, and local armories were poorly guarded. On November 13, 1933, they raided the Auburn Police Department in Indiana, overpowering the night watchman and seizing machine guns, shotguns, revolvers, and ammunition. They left behind chaos and humiliation. A few weeks later, they repeated the feat in Peru, Indiana, emptying the police arsenal of rifles, submachine guns, and bulletproof vests. These raids provided not only equipment, but psychological advantage. The message was unmistakable. No institution, not even the police, was immune. Each new robbery refined their methods. Dillinger's obsession with timing grew absolute. He demanded synchronized watches, specific routes, and predetermined escape vehicles. The cars, typically fast models like Fords or Buicks, were stolen shortly before each heist, repainted or abandoned afterward. Lookouts were stationed strategically near main roads. Gasoline cans were hidden in advance along getaway paths. To outside observers, the gang's operations resembled small-scale military maneuvers. They were executing robberies with the precision of field campaigns. By December, their exploits were being chronicled in papers from Chicago to Kansas City. Reporters coined new phrases: machine gun men, bandit engineers, public enemies. Dillinger's name, though shared by his accomplices, became shorthand for the entire phenomenon. His sharp suits, easy smile, and reputation for control turned him into a reluctant celebrity. Yet behind the photographs lay exhaustion and paranoia. The gang's members were hunted men, sleeping with their weapons close and their cars idling outside safe houses. As winter closed in, the robberies grew more violent. The First National Bank of East Chicago became a turning point. During the robbery, a police officer, William O'Malley, was shot and killed. Witnesses claimed Dillinger himself fired the fatal rounds, though later accounts suggested John Hamilton may have pulled the trigger. It made little difference. The act marked Dillinger as a killer in the public mind. What had once been seen as cunning now looked like cold-blooded ruthlessness. The response from law enforcement was swift. State police organized poses equipped with shotguns and rifles, often assisted by National Guardsmen. Checkpoints appeared on highways across Indiana, but the gang's movements were unpredictable. They traveled in overlapping circles, robbing a bank in one county, while the police pursued rumors in another. At every stop, Dillinger altered his appearance. Hair dyed, mustache grown, suits changed daily. He knew visibility was both his power and his weakness. The Bureau of Investigation began compiling a detailed case file. Agents collected fingerprints from abandoned vehicles, photographs from surveillance, and witness descriptions from bank employees. The Identification Division in Washington cataloged every piece of evidence, cross-referencing it with other crimes in the Midwest. Hoover, eager to prove the Bureau's value, authorized field offices to cooperate directly with local departments. For the first time, federal coordination became central to a criminal manhunt. Inside the gang, tension simmered. Pierpont and Mackley argued over leadership. Some favored retreating west to lie low. Others wanted to strike larger targets. Dillinger, pragmatic, recognized that constant movement was their only safety. He proposed heading south to escape the intensifying pressure. They agreed reluctantly. In late December, the group scattered temporarily to mislead the authorities, agreeing to reunite in Florida under false identities. The journey south was marked by near misses. In Kentucky, police recognized one of their stolen cars, but lost them in mountain roads. In Tennessee, they switched license plates at a roadside diner minutes before a patrol arrived. Each narrow escape deepened their reliance on precision. They avoided rail travel, used cash exclusively, and maintained coded communication through mailed postcards addressed to fictitious names. The pattern of these escapes hinted at Dillinger's evolving mindset: crime as calculation, survival as system. While the gang moved south, the Bureau worked north. Hoover's agents traced Dillinger's earlier movements through gas receipts, hotel registries, and statements from automobile dealers. Each detail, insignificant alone, began forming a larger network. The Bureau realized that Dillinger's gang represented more than a string of robberies. It embodied a new kind of criminal mobility that state agencies were unequipped to confront. Hoover seized on the moment to expand his campaign for federal authority. In January 1934, he would succeed, but that was still months away. In the meantime, the gang found temporary refuge in Florida. Warm weather, transient populations, and loose policing made it a convenient hiding ground. Dillinger rented small cabins under assumed names, moving every few weeks. The group lived modestly, spending stolen money cautiously. Newspapers still carried stories of their crimes, but distance dulled the sense of pursuit. For a short period, the fugitives felt invisible again. Yet freedom carried its own risks. Discipline slackened. Some indulged in gambling and drink. Dillinger, though outwardly relaxed, remained vigilant. He spent hours studying maps, tracing possible routes westward, already planning the next move. The public's fascination with Dillinger only grew. The more the press romanticized his exploits, the more local authorities faced ridicule. Small-town sheriffs received anonymous letters praising the outlaw who robbed banks that had foreclosed on farmers' homes. The contradiction was striking. A man who killed police officers was being cast as a folk hero. For Hoover and the Bureau, this was intolerable. The Dillinger case would not only be about law enforcement, it would be about restoring faith in the government itself. The gang's temporary calm began to unravel at the start of 1934. They needed funds again. Florida offered safety, not opportunity. Dillinger proposed moving west, where bank security was lighter and winter roads provided cover. The plan was to head through Missouri and Texas, eventually finding refuge in Tucson, Arizona. The desert city's isolation and mild climate made it an ideal hideout. The decision would mark both their survival and their undoing. By late December, law enforcement had traced the gang's movement as far as Louisiana. Several members were nearly caught in Shreveport, escaping only because a patrolman misidentified their car. Their luck was remarkable, but their visibility increased with every encounter. The Bureau's circulars now carried Dillinger's photo to every police department in the country. Rewards totaled thousands of dollars. The image, clean-shaven, confident, eyes fixed on the camera, became one of the most recognized faces in America. As the year ended, Dillinger's world had changed irrevocably. In less than 8 months, he had evolved from a paroled inmate to the leader of the most infamous criminal organization in the United States. His crimes were not the reckless acts of desperation that characterized Depression-era banditry. They were structured operations, built on planning and precision. The infrastructure of pursuit was changing alongside him. Hoover's Bureau, driven by the need to prove its effectiveness, was laying the groundwork for modern federal law enforcement. The collision between them was inevitable. In the chill of late December 1933, Dillinger's convoy crossed the Mississippi River under cover of night. They carried thousands in stolen cash, several submachine guns, and enough ammunition to outlast most police forces. Their cars, freshly painted to disguise ownership, moved west toward the desert. Behind them trailed a dozen state warrants, unserved but gathering force. Before the new year began, they would reach Arizona, where a chance fire would expose them and shift the story from myth to capture. The birth of the Dillinger Gang had taken less than 3 months. Its impact on American law enforcement would last for decades. In that short span, they had robbed more than a dozen banks, armed themselves with military weapons, and killed multiple officers. They had humiliated local authorities and forced the Bureau to adapt in real time. What began as loyalty among convicts had become a national emergency. Their era of mobility and violence was reshaping the rules of pursuit. In the towns they left behind, bullet holes marked walls, and fear lingered in bank corridors. Yet to many Americans struggling under depression hardship, the gang's defiance remained oddly magnetic. Dillinger represented the illusion of control in a world that had lost it. He had turned rebellion into discipline, crime into coordination, and desperation into spectacle. But even then, his trajectory was narrowing. For every day of freedom, the Bureau was closing the gap. The pattern of his life, imprisonment, escape, ascent, was reaching its midpoint. The fall, when it came, would be swift. The new year opened with heat instead of frost. In January 1934, while much of the Midwest froze under winter storms, the desert city of Tucson, Arizona, basked in unbroken sunlight. It was a quiet town of narrow streets and stucco buildings, far removed from the chaos of Chicago or Indianapolis. To John Dillinger and his men, it offered what they needed most: distance, anonymity, and time. They arrived in separate cars, using false names, registering in different hotels scattered across the downtown district. To the townspeople, they looked like prosperous travelers, escaping the northern cold. In truth, they were fugitives, carrying enough weapons to supply a small army. For several weeks, Tucson held the illusion of safety. The gang's scattered members, Dillinger, Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and Harry Copeland, kept to themselves, meeting only when necessary. They moved cautiously, spending money sparingly, to avoid suspicion. Dillinger stayed under an alias, in a modest lodging house, blending among salesmen and tourists. He spent his days reading newspapers that still printed his name above headlines about unsolved robberies and widening manhunts. His photograph appeared everywhere. He knew the country was closing in. Yet in the quiet desert evenings, that knowledge felt distant. The gang had planned to regroup, rest, and decide their next move. The Florida hideouts had grown risky, and the Midwest was crawling with lawmen. Arizona's isolation seemed perfect. No one here had ever seen their faces, and the Bureau's reach had not yet extended this far west. The plan was simple: wait out the pressure, divide the remaining money, and vanish separately until spring. But the safety they imagined was already unraveling. At the Hotel Congress, two of the gang's members, Pierpont and Mackley, rented adjoining rooms under false names. They carried luggage heavy enough to draw comment from the bellhops. But in a town used to winter visitors, nothing seemed unusual. Their weapons, ammunition, and cash remained hidden inside the suitcases. On the night of January 22nd, 1934, fate intervened. Around midnight, smoke began to rise from the hotel's lower floors. A small electrical fire spread quickly through the structure, sending guests into the corridors. Fire alarms clanged, and within minutes, the Tucson Fire Department arrived. Flames licked the wooden staircases, and guests hurriedly gathered their belongings. Pierpont and Mackley, unable to carry their heavy cases through the smoke, left them behind. They asked firefighters to retrieve the luggage from their rooms, offering generous tips for the service. The request was casual, almost routine. But when firemen entered the room and struggled to move the cases, curiosity overcame obedience. The weight seemed unnatural for clothing or personal effects. They opened one. Inside lay a Thompson submachine gun, several revolvers, and a stack of crisp bills marked from Midwestern banks. The discovery spread quickly through the crew working the fire. Someone recognized the faces from wanted circulars pinned to the station wall. By dawn, the local police had alerted federal authorities. Tucson's quiet streets filled with patrol cars and plainclothes detectives. The fugitives, unaware of the discovery, remained in separate lodgings across town. The coordinated arrests began within hours. Russell Clark was taken first, surprised in his hotel room, while cleaning one of the rifles. He surrendered without resistance. Harry Copeland was captured soon after, cornered in a nearby boarding house. The news traveled fast. By mid-morning, officers surrounded the Hotel Congress itself. Pierpont and Mackley tried to flee through a rear stairwell, but were blocked. Armed police stormed the building, and within minutes, the two men were disarmed and handcuffed. Dillinger, lodged several blocks away, heard the commotion too late. Word spread through the small city, faster than he could react. Police roadblocks sealed the exits. Every intersection bristled with rifles and shotguns. He considered escape, but realized the network was already closed. At noon on January 23, 1934, officers arrived at his door. They found him calm, standing near a window, unarmed. The arrest was quiet, professional, final. After months of pursuit, the man whose name had terrorized the Midwest was in custody. The authorities paraded their captives before reporters. Cameras flashed, and the photographs traveled instantly through the national press. On a table in front of them lay the recovered weapons: 3 Thompson submachine guns, 2 Winchester rifles, modified as machine guns, 5 bulletproof vests, and more than $25,000 in cash, part of it traced to the East Chicago bank robbery. The visual display turned victory into spectacle. Dillinger and his men, once masters of publicity, now faced it as prisoners. For the law, Tucson marked a triumph. For the gang, it was the beginning of the end. The group that had once moved as a disciplined unit was now fragmented. Each man faced transfer to different states and separate trials. Dillinger was extradited to Indiana, charged with the murder of Officer O'Malley during the East Chicago robbery. Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark were held for the murder of Sheriff Sarber in Ohio. The network that had sustained them through prison and escape was dismantled by a fire, a coincidence as cruel as any deliberate trap. Dillinger's transport from Arizona drew national attention. He was escorted by heavily armed officers, his wrists chained, his expression unreadable. Reporters described him as calm, confident, even amused, interpreting restraint as arrogance. Yet the reality beneath that composure was calculation. Every new experience, the handling of guards, the timing of stops, the architecture of jails, was absorbed and analyzed. He had learned long ago that knowledge was the key to survival. When he reached Crown Point, Indiana, the state prepared for his trial with exaggerated confidence. The jail was newly reinforced, the sheriff's staff doubled, and officials boasted that their facility was escape-proof. They had seen too many headlines of lawmen humiliated. They would not repeat the pattern. Dillinger was placed in a secure cell on the upper floor, his every movement watched by guards and reporters alike. For weeks, the press chronicled his confinement as though it were theater. His meals, his demeanor, his occasional smiles at visitors. To the public, it was spectacle. To Dillinger, it was reconnaissance. While he awaited trial, the rest of his gang faced their own unraveling. Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark were extradited to Ohio, tried for the murder of Sheriff Sarber, and convicted within months. Pierpont and Mackley received death sentences. Clark was given life imprisonment. The men who had once orchestrated Dillinger's freedom were now condemned to die in the electric chair. From his cell in Crown Point, Dillinger read about their fates with a detached clarity. Loyalty had been their code, but survival was his. The Bureau of Investigation celebrated the Arizona captures as proof of its growing reach. Hoover's office released statements praising coordination between local and federal forces. Newspapers published photographs of the captured men with headlines declaring the end of the Midwest crime wave. Yet even as they celebrated, the Bureau's authority remained fragile. Its agents could investigate, but not yet arrest without local cooperation. Hoover's ambitions required results that would silence critics permanently. In the months to come, Dillinger himself would supply that opportunity. Back in Crown Point, the jail settled into routine. Dillinger was allowed limited privileges: newspapers, visits, occasional recreation, under supervision. He studied his surroundings carefully. Guard rotations, key rings, door positions, the rhythm of daily movement. Among the inmates, his reputation made him untouchable. Guards treated him with a mix of fascination and caution. He responded with politeness, never anger, building an image of compliance that lowered defenses. Outside, the public followed every update, as if reading a serialized story. Photographs of the jail appeared in magazines. Caricatures of Dillinger's face filled pulp newspapers. His notoriety made him both prisoner and celebrity. The governor received letters from citizens urging swift execution, while others demanded mercy. For Hoover, the case remained a symbol of modern criminal pursuit. For Dillinger, it was a laboratory. Late in February 1934, construction work in the jail provided him with an opportunity. A few pieces of scrap wood and black shoe polish were enough for a tool, crude in form, but convincing from a distance. The legend of the wooden gun would later take many forms, but the principle remained the same. deception through observation. Dillinger tested his creation in silence, timing guard responses and distances. Every step was rehearsed in his mind. On the morning of March 3rd, 1934, he acted. When the moment came, he confronted the guards with calm precision. The weapon, though false, appeared real enough to command obedience. Within minutes, he had locked the jailers in their own cells, seized 2 machine guns from the armory, and ordered the opening of the main door. He stepped into the corridor, collected car keys from the desk, and walked out of the building that Indiana had declared impregnable. Outside, snow flurries drifted across the street. He climbed into the sheriff's Ford V8, started the engine, and drove away. The escape stunned the nation. Hours later, when the car was found abandoned in Chicago, the implications were clear. By crossing the Indiana-Illinois state line in a stolen vehicle, Dillinger had violated the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, a federal offense. What had been a matter for local police now belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover's jurisdiction expanded overnight. The most wanted man in America had inadvertently given the Bureau the legal authority to hunt him anywhere. For Dillinger, it was another victory in a string of escapes, but the consequences would prove irreversible. He had outwitted the state, but awakened the federal machine that would end him. The Bureau began mobilizing at once, distributing circulars, coordinating field offices, and compiling data. Agents studied his methods, his contacts, his history. Hoover saw in Dillinger the perfect adversary, intelligent, visible, and dangerous, enough to justify every new measure of power the Bureau sought. On the morning of March 3rd, 1934, he acted. When the moment came, he confronted the guards with calm precision. The weapon, though false, appeared real enough to command obedience. Within minutes, he had locked the jailers in their own cells, seized 2 machine guns from the armory, and ordered the opening of the main door. He stepped into the corridor, collected car keys from the desk, and walked out of the building that Indiana had declared impregnable. Outside, snow flurries drifted across the street. He climbed into the sheriff's Ford V8, started the engine, and drove away. The escape stunned the nation. Hours later, when the car was found abandoned in Chicago, the implications were clear. By crossing the Indiana-Illinois state line in a stolen vehicle, Dillinger had violated the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, a federal offense. What had been a matter for local police now belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover's jurisdiction expanded overnight. The most wanted man in America had inadvertently given the Bureau the legal authority to hunt him anywhere. For Dillinger, it was another victory in a string of escapes, but the consequences would prove irreversible. He had outwitted the state, but awakened the federal machine that would end him. The Bureau began mobilizing at once, distributing circulars, coordinating field offices, and compiling data. Agents studied his methods, his contacts, his history. Hoover saw in Dillinger the perfect adversary, intelligent, visible, and dangerous, enough to justify every new measure of power the Bureau sought. The winter morning began like every other inside the Crown Point Jail. Steel doors unlocking, boots echoing across the cell block, guards exchanging routine greetings that carried no trace of fear. The man they guarded had been calm for weeks, polite, even genial. A model prisoner who read newspapers and joked lightly with attendants. Yet behind that calm exterior, John Dillinger was studying everything. The angles of corridors, the sequence of guard changes, the texture of locks, the exact sound of keys turning. He had been here long enough to understand that nothing called escape-proof truly was. Every system relied on habit, and habit was the one pattern he could always break. In his small cell, Dillinger's hands worked quietly with scraps of wood from a broken washboard. He shaved the fragments with a dull razor blade, shaping them into the crude outline of a pistol. It was an act of improvisation born of 8 years in prison, patience, craft, and a mind that refused stillness. The form was rough but convincing. He blackened it with shoe polish, until it gleamed like blued steel. The shape alone would command obedience, if held with confidence. He rehearsed its grip, its weight, the illusion of menace it created. The jail's security depended not on bars, but on perception, and perception was his greatest weapon. Outside his cell, the guards trusted the routine. Reporters came often to see the famous outlaw who had terrified the Midwest, photographing him as though he were an exhibit rather than a prisoner. They described his composure, his charm, his easy laughter. Those images ran nationwide, transforming the jail into a stage, and Dillinger into its silent actor. Even the sheriff's wife visited occasionally, bringing him cigarettes and newspapers, remarking that he seemed almost civilized. The illusion worked because Dillinger understood its power. The moment he appeared tame, vigilance around him softened. He counted days, not toward trial but toward opportunity. His study of the jail revealed small truths: the location of the keys, the habit of guards to leave doors unlocked between shifts, the precise time when the sheriff stepped out for lunch. By early March of 1934, every variable aligned. The opportunity would not come again. That morning, March 3rd, began with quiet air and filtered sunlight. Glancing through narrow windows, Dillinger appeared calm as the guards passed by. His demeanor unchanged. He waited until the corridor thinned of movement, then stepped to the bars and called a guard closer. The wooden pistol, dark and realistic, extended through the gap with unwavering steadiness. The guard froze, eyes fixed on the weapon, not daring to test its authenticity. Within seconds, Dillinger had ordered the cell door opened, reversed positions, and locked his captor inside. The act was swift, precise, almost surgical. He moved from cell to cell, repeating the process, disarming panic with authority. Each command was silent, but understood. When a second guard hesitated, Dillinger seized his real pistol from its holster, ending doubt entirely. He collected keys, weapons, and the confidence that follows momentum. In less than 10 minutes, the jail designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminal had become his own fortress. He unlocked the stairwell door, descended calmly, and entered the administrative office, where the sheriff's car keys hung neatly on a rack. He took them all. Outside, the town was quiet, unaware. He walked across the courtyard, wearing a guard's overcoat, the stolen pistol visible in his hand. No one questioned him. He stepped into the sheriff's Ford V8, started the engine, and drove toward the main gate. The sentry waved him through. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Dillinger was already disappearing down the snow-dusted road, the hum of the car fading into the distance. It was mid-morning when word reached the sheriff. The disbelief was instant and complete. Newspapers described the reaction in blunt terms. John Dillinger had escaped again. The state's claim of escape-proof was in ruins. Reporters crowded the jail, photographing the cell door, the locks, the path of exit. The wooden gun became legend before noon. Half disbelief, half humiliation. For law enforcement, it was catastrophe. For the Bureau of Investigation in Washington, it was transformation. By stealing the sheriff's car and driving it across the Indiana-Illinois state line, Dillinger had violated the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, a federal law passed in 1919 that prohibited the transportation of stolen vehicles between states. The moment he crossed that invisible border, his crime ceased to be local. It became federal. For the first time, the Bureau had legal jurisdiction to hunt him directly, without the permission of state authorities. J. Edgar Hoover seized the opportunity immediately. What had begun as a chase by small-town sheriffs was now a national manhunt, led by the most ambitious lawman in America. The Bureau's files expanded overnight. Circulars were printed bearing Dillinger's photograph, sharp-featured, confident, always in a suit. His image appeared in post offices, police stations, and border checkpoints across the country. Red metal tags marked his fingerprints in the identification division, indicating top priority. Field offices in Chicago, Indianapolis, and St. Paul coordinated daily updates through telegraph. Hoover himself supervised every development, viewing the case not merely as pursuit, but as validation. Success would prove that the Bureau could enforce law across state lines. Failure would expose its limits. Meanwhile, Dillinger's escape turned him into a national obsession. Crowds gathered outside the Crown Point jail to see the hole in the routine that had freed him. Souvenir seekers chipped paint from the doorframe. Reporters interviewed guards who still could not explain how it happened. The Ford V8 he stole became part of the mythology, a symbol of speed and audacity. When it was found abandoned in Chicago, photographers captured every angle, turning the vehicle into relic. Dillinger, meanwhile, vanished into the sprawl of Chicago's underworld, where sympathizers offered shelter. The city's network of criminals, gamblers, and corrupt officials made it a natural refuge. He shaved his mustache, changed clothes, and began planning his next move. The stolen cash from previous robberies still supported him. He knew the Bureau's attention was absolute now. Every associate was a potential informer, every alley a risk, yet his confidence remained intact. The same ingenuity that built the wooden gun convinced him he could outthink the entire federal apparatus. Hoover's men moved fast. Agents under Melvin Purvis in Chicago began tracing Dillinger's former associates, mapping his known hideouts and contacts. Surveillance expanded to banks, boarding houses, and hospitals, where his wounds might have been treated. The Bureau adopted new methods: fingerprint cross-checks, vehicle identification numbers, and centralized data, innovations rare in 1934. The manhunt became a testing ground for modern federal policing. Dillinger had forced the Bureau to evolve. For weeks, rumors multiplied. Sightings emerged from Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Every robbery, even those unrelated, was attributed to him. The public fascination bordered on hysteria. Some citizens claimed to have seen him on trains or in restaurants. Others wrote letters to Hoover, describing dreams in which Dillinger appeared. His notoriety was no longer confined to fact. It had become folklore. Within law enforcement, admiration and resentment coexisted. Many officers quietly acknowledged his intelligence, his prison-crafted ingenuity, turning a washboard into a weapon, a jail into a weakness, was undeniable. Yet every display of brilliance deepened the Bureau's resolve to destroy him. Hoover used his name to justify broader reforms, centralized fingerprint files, interstate cooperation, and armed field agents, authorized to shoot when necessary. Dillinger's defiance was shaping the very system built to end him. In the weeks following the escape, the Bureau documented every known robbery in the region. Dillinger's gang, newly reassembled, struck banks in Indiana and Wisconsin, often within days of his movements. Witnesses described men in trench coats, armed with submachine guns, moving with rehearsed precision. Though the Bureau suspected his involvement, proof was elusive. Each heist left behind confusion, conflicting accounts, and the growing legend of a man who could not be caught. Inside the Bureau's Chicago office, Purvis and his team mapped potential routes of escape across the Great Lakes region. They identified hideouts, safe houses, and sympathetic families. Agents shadowed every known associate, intercepting mail and tracking license plates. Hoover demanded daily updates. Every failure was met with new instructions, new methods, greater pressure. The Bureau's culture of precision and accountability was born from this hunt. For Dillinger, life on the run became ritual. He moved nightly, sleeping in basements, barns, or safe houses. He traveled under aliases: Mr. Hellman, Mr. Black, Mr. Ryan, always adjusting the details. When possible, he returned to Mooresville to visit his father and half-brother, slipping into town under cover of darkness. Family ties still held, but the visits carried risk. The Bureau had begun watching his relatives, hoping loyalty would betray him. It never did. Dillinger's father, despite moral condemnation, refused cooperation, claiming ignorance of his son's movements. The wooden gun, now immortalized in print, haunted law enforcement pride. Jokes circulated in speakeasies about guards who could not tell wood from steel. Hoover despised such mockery. He issued internal memos forbidding agents from speaking of the escape, except in professional terms. Yet he understood its symbolic power. Dillinger's audacity had humiliated institutions, and that humiliation would fuel the Bureau's determination. In Chicago, Dillinger's path intersected with a new set of criminals: Homer Van Meter, Eddie Green, Tommy Carroll, and Lester, Babyface Nelson. Men who matched his ambition and lacked hesitation. They admired his reputation and offered resources, weapons, vehicles, and money laundering networks. The new alliance was dangerous, not only for its firepower, but for its unpredictability. Van Meter's recklessness and Nelson's volatility contrasted sharply with Dillinger's calculated composure. Yet, for the moment, shared survival outweighed differences. The group's first major act together came soon after, when they robbed a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, leaving behind shell casings and chaos. Witnesses described precise movements, covering fire and vehicles positioned for instant escape. The Bureau, tracking patterns of operation, confirmed Dillinger's leadership. Hoover authorized pursuit with any necessary means. The term would soon become infamous. By late March 1934, the Bureau's focus narrowed to two cities, St. Paul and Chicago. Both known for corruption and sheltering fugitives, Dillinger preferred St. Paul for its criminal-friendly police network. He rented apartments under aliases and relied on sympathetic landlords. The environment suited his need for invisibility. Yet invisibility could not last in a city watched by federal agents. While the Bureau intensified surveillance, newspapers continued romanticizing him. Stories exaggerated his charm and ingenuity, portraying him as a Depression-era Robin Hood. The myth ignored the dead officers and terrified bystanders left in his wake. Hoover, angered by the glamorization, instructed press agents to release photographs of crime scenes, hoping to erode sympathy. Still, the fascination endured. The escape from Crown Point had become more than an event. It was a national dividing line between law and legend. The man who carved freedom from wood had turned a local jailbreak into the catalyst for a modern federal machine. Every innovation of the Bureau, fingerprint tracking, rapid communication, armed response, found its first proving ground in pursuit of him. As spring approached, Dillinger's world tightened. The network of informants grew, the number of safe houses shrank, and the Bureau's coordination improved daily. Yet his confidence persisted. Every successful escape reaffirmed his belief that control could be maintained through planning and audacity. What he could not see was that the very precision he relied on was being studied, replicated, and turned against him. The wooden gun lay behind him now, perhaps discarded, perhaps hidden, but its echo followed everywhere. It had freed him once, but it had also built the walls that would finally close around him. In Washington, the telegram arrived before dawn. It carried one line of text. Dillinger escaped, stole sheriff's car, believed en route to Chicago. The words ignited the Bureau's headquarters like a fuse inside the gray walls of the Department of Justice building. Typewriters clattered as agents gathered in the corridors, reading the morning's headlines that mocked state authorities. Escape-proof jail. Outwitted by Dillinger's wooden gun, America's most dangerous man vanishes again. To the Bureau, it was humiliation by proxy. But to J. Edgar Hoover, it was opportunity. The escape gave him what he had long demanded: federal jurisdiction. Under the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, Dillinger's theft of the sheriff's Ford had turned a state crime into a federal pursuit. Hoover wasted no time. He ordered every field office to report directly to Washington on any sighting, movement, or associate linked to the outlaw. Within hours, agents in Chicago, Indianapolis, and St. Paul were mobilized. The era of small-town pursuit was over. The modern manhunt had begun. In Chicago, Hoover appointed Special Agent Melvin Purvis to lead operations. Purvis, a precise, soft-spoken man in his early 30s, commanded respect among agents for his discipline and restraint. From his office on Michigan Avenue, he built what became the first coordinated federal task force dedicated to one fugitive. Maps of the Midwest covered the walls, threaded with red lines marking railways, highways, and suspected hideouts. Each morning, agents updated the charts with new reports: stolen cars, bank robberies, and witness statements. The lines multiplied like veins across a growing organism of pursuit. The Bureau's methods were evolving with the chase. Telegraph networks transmitted descriptions faster than newspapers could print them. Fingerprint records, once scattered among local departments, were now centralized in Washington's Identification Division, where technicians compared new prints against Dillinger's known file, marked with red metal tags. Field agents carried portable cameras, photographing crime scenes, and sending the negatives by train to headquarters. For the first time, data, not rumor, guided pursuit. Dillinger, meanwhile, watched the transformation from the shadows. Chicago's underworld provided temporary refuge, but the pressure was visible everywhere. Tavern owners whispered of agents posing as drunks. Safe houses emptied overnight. The city's criminal fraternity, once welcoming, began to close its doors. Association with him was no longer a mark of defiance, but a death sentence. He responded with mobility, the same principle that had sustained him since his first parole. He never slept in one place twice, never trusted the same ally twice, never repeated the same route. Yet even he could sense the difference. The law was no longer chasing, it was calculating. In late March, Hoover's men began implementing what he called concentric containment. The plan divided the Midwest into operational zones, each with agents assigned to cover highways, airports, and rail lines. Dillinger's photograph was distributed to service stations, hotel clerks, and taxi drivers. Field offices used code systems to track sightings, and every intercepted rumor was logged in a ledger marked ever, the first case file ever designated, solely for a single fugitive. The Bureau's arsenal expanded as well. Hoover secured authorization for his agents to carry Thompson submachine guns, the same weapon Dillinger favored. They trained in marksmanship and tactical coordination, transforming from investigators into combatants. He also established direct communication between Washington and every major police department in the region. It was the skeleton of the National Crime Information Network that would one day span the country, and it was built in real time, under the pressure of Dillinger's evasion. Each success and failure shaped the Bureau's identity. When agents raided a farmhouse near Joliet and found it empty, Hoover demanded a full debrief on timing and communication. When a stolen car in Iowa matched Dillinger's description but led to another criminal entirely, the misidentification was recorded as a case study for procedural reform. Every mistake became a lesson, every lesson a building block for the agency's future. Dillinger was not only being hunted, he was training the Bureau that would outlast him. While the Bureau refined its machine, Dillinger was assembling his own. In Chicago, he reconnected with Homer Van Meter, a volatile gunman with a soldier's instincts, and Lester Babyface Nelson, whose deceptively boyish appearance concealed ruthless aggression. Eddie Green and Tommy Carroll completed the group. Together they formed a new gang, faster and deadlier than the one broken in Tucson. They carried automatic rifles, bulletproof vests, and grenades stolen from National Guard armories. Their vehicles were customized with reinforced bumpers and modified engines for higher speeds. They planned not only survival, but dominance. The next months became a test of endurance. Dillinger's gang struck banks across the Midwest, from Mason City to Sioux Falls, seizing tens of thousands in cash. Their operations followed the same formula, perfected in 1933: speed, precision, and control. But the world had changed. Each robbery now triggered a federal response, measured in hours, not days. The Bureau's network had become fluid, relaying information from one state to the next. Before Dillinger's car reached the border, the radius of pursuit was tightening. Hoover's headquarters in Washington functioned like a war room. Large wall maps showed the United States divided into quadrants, pins marking robberies, safe houses, and confirmed sightings. Analysts tracked the movement of Dillinger's stolen cars, using license numbers reported from roadside checks. For the first time, law enforcement treated one man's movements as a national campaign. Hoover relished the drama. Each press release emphasized the Bureau's coordination and resolve. The image of Dillinger as public enemy number one was not only an accurate description of his crimes, it was a strategic construction to elevate the Bureau's importance. The criminal and the institution were now intertwined, each fueling the other's legend. In Chicago, Purvis's team established constant surveillance over known criminal hangouts: the Hotel Sherman, the Lincoln Court Apartments, the Lincoln Tavern, and the Bel Ray Apartments. Agents blended into neighborhoods, renting rooms under assumed names, watching entrances, noting patterns. Informants were paid in cash, their tips relayed to Washington hourly. The Bureau began experimenting with new investigative techniques, including handwriting analysis and early wiretaps on suspected telephones. Every technological advantage was tested against a single man's ability to vanish. Dillinger countered with simplicity. He relied on cash only, avoided telephones, and changed cars weekly. His discipline made him difficult to trap, yet his growing notoriety drew attention. He could not control. He became both invisible and unmistakable. A man known everywhere, recognized nowhere. He read about himself in newspapers, learning details of his supposed whereabouts that were entirely false. The myths multiplied faster than the facts, and in that chaos he found temporary safety. But the Bureau's learning curve was steep. In St. Paul, Minnesota, agents began monitoring all new apartment rentals, comparing handwriting samples and tenant names against lists of aliases previously used by Dillinger. The city, long a haven for criminals due to corrupt officials, was changing. The newly appointed police chief cooperated with federal agents, allowing surveillance without warrants, a controversial move that reflected the growing desperation to end the case. By mid-March, intelligence reports indicated that Dillinger and a woman matching the description of Evelyn Billy Frechette, his girlfriend, had rented an apartment under the name Hellman. Purvis relayed the information to Washington, requesting authorization for a controlled raid. Hoover's approval came immediately. The stage for confrontation was set. Before that decisive encounter, the Bureau tightened its logistical net. Field agents were now equipped with portable two-way radios, primitive but effective within city limits. Cars were stationed at all major exits from St. Paul. The operation required secrecy and patience, qualities Dillinger's unpredictability made difficult to sustain. Still, Hoover insisted the Bureau act decisively. A single successful capture would erase months of embarrassment. As March turned to April, Dillinger's gang continued to shift between safe houses, unaware that the Bureau was closing in. The chase had evolved beyond mere pursuit. It was now an arms race between intuition and information, speed and structure, improvisation and bureaucracy. The Bureau had more men, more resources, and growing legal authority. But Dillinger had something harder to replicate: instinct. He understood people, movement, and timing, the human elements that no amount of paperwork could predict. Yet the walls were narrowing. Each new day brought fresh restrictions. Each new theft, another headline that sharpened public outrage. The government had begun to see him not simply as a criminal, but as a challenge to its authority. Hoover, always attuned to symbolism, understood that capturing Dillinger would legitimize federal law enforcement in the public eye. He instructed Purvis personally: the outlaw's reign must end soon, and publicly. Agents worked around the clock. Informants in taverns and hotels provided a constant stream of minor leads. Many proved false, but every rumor was recorded and cross-referenced. The Bureau's files on Dillinger grew to hundreds of pages: bank blueprints, mugshots, handwriting samples, and coded letters. The system that would one day define modern criminal databases began here, built in the urgency of this hunt. For Dillinger, the strain showed. The escape from Crown Point had given him fame, but fame carried its own gravity. Every movement was shadowed by whispers, every alliance by risk. Friends grew cautious, fearing association. Even in criminal circles, he was becoming radioactive, too visible, too pursued. The safe havens of the underworld were closing one by one. He began to rely more heavily on Frechette, whose quiet loyalty offered brief reprieve from the chaos. Together, they moved from city to city, posing as traveling salespeople or married couples. The disguises fooled hotel clerks, but not the Bureau's relentless pattern recognition. By the end of March, the pursuit reached a breaking point. Hoover demanded results. Purvis, after weeks of surveillance, believed he had finally pinpointed Dillinger's location. The Lincoln Court Apartments, in St. Paul. The operation was set for the following morning. Agents gathered at dawn, armed with submachine guns, revolvers, and tear gas. The city stirred under a cold wind, as the convoy of unmarked cars rolled quietly toward the address. The raid that awaited would mark the Bureau's first direct confrontation with America's most wanted man. The manhunt had entered its second phase. No longer a chase across miles, but a siege of rooms, hallways, and doors. The Bureau, once reactive, was now proactive, trained by its own failures, and driven by Hoover's obsession. Dillinger's intelligence had built his legend. Now it would be tested against an organization that had learned to think like him. In the narrow streets of St. Paul, the line between myth and method blurred. The wooden gun had made him a symbol. The hunt would make him history. The spring air over St. Paul, Minnesota, carried the gray stillness of a city that had not yet woken. Streets glistened from overnight rain, and the faint hum of early traffic drifted through the narrow alleys near Lexington Avenue. At Lincoln Court Apartments, nothing distinguished apartment 303 from the others, except the unease of its tenants. They had arrived weeks earlier, registering under the names Mr. and Mrs. Hellman, claiming to be traveling salespeople. To the landlord, they seemed polite, but guarded. To the Bureau of Investigation, they fit the pattern exactly. At sunrise, unmarked cars rolled to a silent stop along the curb. Doors opened without sound. Men stepped out, federal agents, and local police, coats buttoned tight against the cold, submachine guns hidden beneath. The operation had been planned for days, but no plan ever survived first contact. Special Agent Melvin Purvis watched from a distance, his nerves masked by precision. Orders were simple: surround the building, confirm the suspects, and make the arrest before gunfire erupted. Inside, the quiet figures known as the Hellmans were preparing for an ordinary morning, unaware that the most advanced manhunt in the country had converged on their address. The Bureau's surveillance had begun with a tip from the apartment manager, who noticed strange behavior: curtains drawn, mail collected irregularly, and a tenant who flinched at every unexpected knock. The description matched Evelyn Billy Frechette, Dillinger's companion, down to her dark hair and soft Midwestern accent. Once confirmation reached Washington, Hoover gave the word. Purvis assembled a team from the Chicago field office, coordinating with St. Paul police. The raid would test every lesson learned since the Crown Point escape. Agents positioned themselves along the stairwells and corridors. Their shoes made no sound. On the worn linoleum, a few neighbors, leaving for work, were hurried away with quiet warnings. The order was containment. No alarms, no warnings, no escape. At 7:30 a.m., two agents approached the door of apartment 303. Inside, Frechette moved toward the kitchen as Dillinger, still dressing, caught the faint scuff of movement outside. He froze. Instinct, honed by years of flight, recognized the sound of preparation. The first knock broke the silence. A pause followed, then another, louder this time. Frechette hesitated, then stepped forward and opened the door a crack. In that instant, she saw the badge and the pistol. She slammed the door shut. The agents reacted instantly. One shouted for backup, another kicked the door, splintering the frame. The hallway erupted in motion. From inside, the answering sound was automatic gunfire. Bullets shredded the plaster walls as agents dove for cover. The tight corridor magnified the noise into thunder. Dillinger fired through the half-open door with a Thompson submachine gun, keeping the agents pinned. Splinters rained across the floor. Outside, more agents rushed into position, sealing the building's exits. In the chaos, Dillinger grabbed Frechette by the arm and moved toward the rear of the apartment. A small window led to a fire escape. He kicked it open, sending glass scattering into the alley below. Covering fire from his gun, tore through the hall as he stepped through the frame, guiding Frechette out first. Below, residents screamed and scattered. 2 blocks away, Homer Van Meter waited in a parked car, scanning the street for trouble. When the gunfire started, he knew the operation had gone wrong. He stepped out, firing into the air to create confusion, then sprinted toward the alley. As Dillinger and Frechette descended the fire escape, agents spotted him, and another exchange erupted. Van Meter returned fire, buying seconds for the others to reach the street. He commandeered a passing truck at gunpoint, forcing the driver to speed toward the outskirts of the city. Dillinger and Frechette leapt onto the running board as the vehicle roared away. The raid that was supposed to end the manhunt had ended in smoke and panic. Inside Lincoln Court, silence followed the storm. Agents entered the empty apartment. The Bureau's frustration was immediate. The operation had failed to capture its target, and one agent lay wounded. Hoover's anger traveled by telegram before the smoke cleared. Purvis filed a full report, acknowledging that Dillinger's escape had been a matter of seconds. The Bureau's tactics had improved, but timing still belonged to the outlaw. Dillinger regrouped with his men in Chicago, hiding in the apartment of Eddie Green, one of his most trusted associates. The building, modest and unremarkable, provided temporary safety. Dillinger's left arm carried a bullet wound from the St. Paul escape, shallow but painful. Green tended to it using supplies stolen from a pharmacy, while Frechette, pale and shaken, packed the few possessions they had left. They all knew the Bureau would trace them soon. The agents, meanwhile, swept through St. Paul. They interrogated witnesses, collected shell casings, and retrieved fingerprints from the apartment. The prints, forwarded to Washington, confirmed the obvious. John Dillinger had been there. Hoover responded with new orders. No more caution, no more delays. Agents were to act on intelligence immediately, without waiting for confirmation from headquarters. The Bureau's pursuit, once procedural, was becoming personal. The Bureau, encouraged by her capture, intensified its hunt. Agents raided every known safe house in Chicago, arresting anyone with even distant connections to Dillinger. Those who resisted were beaten, interrogated, or detained without charge. Hoover's campaign for control was spreading through intimidation, as much as investigation. For the Bureau, the end justified the means. For Dillinger, it proved that the government was now playing by his rules. While the Bureau's attention centered on Chicago, Dillinger and Van Meter struck again. In Warsaw, Indiana, they robbed a police station, stealing guns, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. It was an act of defiance, a symbolic strike at the very force pursuing them. The thefts humiliated local authorities and thrilled the press. Each new robbery seemed to reaffirm Dillinger's invincibility, even as the net tightened. He moved north to Upper Michigan, where a small farmhouse offered brief shelter. Agents, tracking his movements through informants, arrived by airplane only hours after he left. The chase was becoming relentless, its pace measured in minutes, instead of days. The Bureau, encouraged by her capture, intensified its hunt. Agents raided every known safe house in Chicago, arresting anyone with even distant connections to Dillinger. Those who resisted were beaten, interrogated, or detained without charge. Hoover's campaign for control was spreading through intimidation, as much as investigation. For the Bureau, the end justified the means. For Dillinger, it proved that the government was now playing by his rules. While the Bureau's attention centered on Chicago, Dillinger and Van Meter struck again. In Warsaw, Indiana, they robbed a police station, stealing guns, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. It was an act of defiance, a symbolic strike at the very force pursuing them. The thefts humiliated local authorities and thrilled the press. Each new robbery seemed to reaffirm Dillinger's invincibility, even as the net tightened. He moved north to Upper Michigan, where a small farmhouse offered brief shelter. Agents, tracking his movements through informants, arrived by airplane only hours after he left. The chase was becoming relentless, its pace measured in minutes, instead of days. Back in Chicago, Purvis reorganized his team. The Bureau's strategy shifted from reaction to anticipation. They began predicting Dillinger's next moves, based on patterns of geography and behavior. His preference for rural hideouts, his tendency to revisit familiar cities. It was early criminal profiling, decades before the term existed. The agents were learning to think like the man they hunted. For Dillinger, the months after St. Paul marked a descent from legend to survival. His resources dwindled, his alliances fractured, his enemies multiplied. The ease with which he once evaded pursuit was giving way to exhaustion. Each day brought new reports of arrests or deaths among his associates. Yet even cornered, his instinct for motion kept him free. He changed identities, altered appearances, and never stayed still long enough to leave a trace. The Bureau's determination grew in proportion to his defiance. Hoover had turned the manhunt into a public crusade, a test of federal strength against individual audacity. Every newspaper update, every radio broadcast reinforced the narrative. Law and order against the outlaw. Public opinion had shifted. Where once some admired Dillinger's cunning, now they demanded his capture. The St. Paul raid had exposed more than a fugitive. It had exposed the future of crime and the future of pursuit. Urban apartments replaced open roads. Machine guns replaced pistols. Federal agents replaced sheriffs. The modern criminal age had arrived, and Dillinger stood at its center. As April closed, the Bureau's surveillance network spanned the entire Midwest. Agents in unmarked cars roamed highways day and night, their radios buzzing with coded messages. Each border crossing, each stolen vehicle, each tip from an informant was logged and plotted on maps. The machinery of federal pursuit was now fully operational. In that machinery, Dillinger was both target and teacher. His escapes dictated policy. His movements rewrote law. The Bureau was learning to operate with the same precision that had once defined his gang. The balance between hunter and hunted was narrowing to a single step. The shootout at Lincoln Court had been only the beginning. Ahead lay Little Bohemia, Wisconsin, a lodge in the woods where both sides would collide again, and the cost of legend would finally be measured in blood. The snow had melted from the pine woods of northern Wisconsin, leaving the ground slick with mud, and the air heavy with thaw. The Little Bohemia Lodge, a rustic inn 40 miles north of Rhinelander, overlooked a chain of quiet lakes and stood at the end of a narrow gravel road bordered by trees. To its owner, it was a spring retreat for city travelers. To John Dillinger and his crew, it became a hiding place at the edge of the world. They arrived on April 19, 1934, in 3 cars bearing false plates, their weapons hidden beneath blankets. Homer Van Meter, Lester Babyface Nelson, Tommy Carroll, John Hamilton, and a handful of others joined Dillinger, who was still nursing the arm wound from St. Paul. They paid the lodge owner in cash and asked few questions. The surrounding forest, the isolation, the single narrow road, it seemed perfect. For the first time in months, they could sleep without sirens echoing through the night. But peace never held long. The group was restless, divided between discipline and recklessness. Dillinger favored silence. Nelson demanded noise. The men drank, played cards, and tested their weapons behind the lodge, their laughter cutting through the still air. The lodge's owner, Emil Wanatka, grew nervous. He recognized Dillinger from newspaper photographs and realized the men under his roof were the same fugitives who filled every front page in the country. He said nothing that night, but fear turned him into an informer. The following day, while pretending to make a supply run, Wanatka slipped into Rhinelander and contacted the police. The call reached the FBI's Milwaukee office within hours. The message was direct. Dillinger and his gang were hiding at Little Bohemia. Hoover received the report by telegraph that evening and ordered an immediate strike. The Bureau could not risk another failure. This raid would be decisive. A task force assembled overnight. 25 federal agents, assisted by state officers and local deputies. They departed before dawn on April 22nd, driving north through sleet and cold wind. Among them was Special Agent W. Carter Baum, a quiet veteran of field work, whose composure under pressure had earned respect within the Bureau. Another car carried Melvin Purvis, still haunted by St. Paul's chaos, but determined to restore the Bureau's credibility. The convoy advanced in near silence, headlights off to avoid detection. 2 cars broke down on the rough forest roads, forcing agents to crowd onto the running boards of the others, gripping rifles against the freezing wind. By the time they reached the final 2-mile stretch, dusk had turned the trees into black silhouettes. The road ended in a curve that opened onto the lodge's clearing, dimly lit by kerosene lamps inside. Dogs barked from somewhere near the porch, their cries slicing through the quiet. Purvis gave the order to dismount. The agents spread through the woods, their shoes sinking into soft earth. They had been told the outlaws were armed with machine guns and would fight to the death. The agents' plan was simple: surround the lodge, cut off escape, and capture the fugitives alive if possible. But clarity in theory rarely survived contact with fear. As the agents approached, 3 local men exited the lodge. They were guests, unconnected to Dillinger: John Hoffman, Eugene Booth, and John Morris. But the agents didn't know it. Mistaking them for gang members, they shouted for them to halt. The startled men ran toward their car. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the windshield and tore into the doors. When the smoke cleared, 1 man was wounded, another dead. The gunfire broke the silence and shattered the element of surprise. Inside the lodge, Dillinger and his men sprang to their weapons. The first burst of machine gun fire from the roof sprayed the clearing, forcing agents to dive for cover behind trees and vehicles. Muzzle flashes blinked through the dark like strobe lights. The Bureau's men returned fire, riddling the lodge's facade with bullets. Wood splinters and glass rained down on the fugitives inside. Dillinger moved fast. He grabbed his rifle, shouted brief orders to Van Meter and Nelson, and ducked toward the rear. They knew the terrain better than their pursuers. Behind the lodge stretched dense forest and a frozen lake, still glazed with ice. In the confusion, the outlaws split into pairs, each heading for the trees. Dillinger and Hamilton slipped out a back window, while Van Meter led Nelson toward the shoreline. Within minutes, the lodge that had promised safety became a war zone. From his position near the front, Agent Baum saw a figure fleeing toward a second cottage 2 miles away, and moved to intercept with 2 local officers. The cottage's windows glowed faintly. Inside, Babyface Nelson was holding 3 hostages, 2 men and a woman. forcing them to remain still, while he watched the road through the window. When Baum's car approached, Nelson opened fire without warning. The first shot struck Baum in the chest. A second hit the constable beside him. The car lurched to a stop. Baum managed to fire once before collapsing. The constable and the other agent were gravely wounded. Nelson stole their vehicle and roared down the road, leaving the three civilians trembling in the doorway. Back at the lodge, the gunfire dwindled. Agents rushed the building and found it nearly empty. Only 3 terrified women remained. The wives or girlfriends of gang members, left behind amid overturned furniture and shattered lamps. Smoke from the firefight drifted through the open doors. The agents advanced cautiously, weapons raised, but there was no more resistance. Outside, the sound of engines receded into the woods. By morning, the truth emerged. Dillinger, Van Meter, Nelson, and Hamilton had escaped through the forest, evading the cordon. The Bureau's casualties included 1 dead, Agent W. Carter Baum, and 2 severely wounded. For the second time in as many months, a federal raid had failed to capture its target. The death of an agent turned the hunt from pursuit into vendetta. News of the disaster reached Washington within hours. Hoover read the telegraph in silence. The details were grim, friendly fire on civilians, poor coordination, and another escape. He convened a meeting that afternoon, dictating orders with clipped precision. Special Agent Samuel A. Cowley was assigned to take command of all operations against Dillinger, with Purvis as his field coordinator. The directive was clear: total concentration of resources until the gang was destroyed. The Bureau's public statement described the raid as a partial success. It claimed several captures and downplayed the fatalities. The press was less forgiving. Headlines questioned the Bureau's competence. "Federal agents bungle again," read one Chicago paper. Editorials accused Hoover of using untrained men for military operations. The Bureau's reputation, already fragile, hung by a thread. For Dillinger, the escape came at a terrible cost. During the flight through the woods, John Hamilton was shot in the back by pursuing agents. He managed to flee with Dillinger and Van Meter, but collapsed days later from blood loss. They buried him secretly near Chicago. The loss marked the beginning of the gang's disintegration. Each survivor now moved more like a fugitive than a soldier. The men scattered. Nelson stole another car and disappeared east. Van Meter returned to Chicago to contact criminal allies. Dillinger, exhausted and half-starved, hid in a farmhouse near Manitowish Waters, nursing frostbitten hands and planning his next move. The cold had nearly finished what the Bureau could not. In Chicago, Purvis reorganized. The Little Bohemia disaster had exposed every weakness in the Bureau's field operations: lack of training, poor communication, and the limits of coordination with local police. Cowley's first act was to impose structure. Agents were drilled in tactical formations, communication signals, and rapid-fire discipline. He ordered the creation of specialized flying squads, capable of deploying anywhere within hours. The Bureau that emerged from Little Bohemia was no longer a collection of investigators. It was becoming a national strike force. Hoover understood the symbolic weight of Baum's death. He turned the agent into a martyr, publicly honoring him as the first fallen hero of the federal war on crime. The gesture transformed the narrative. Where headlines once mocked, they now sympathized. The Bureau's loss became proof of sacrifice. The manhunt, once questioned, was recast as moral crusade. Meanwhile, Dillinger's reputation reached its peak. The public followed his movements as if tracking a myth. Songs were written about him. Photographs circulated like trading cards. And eyewitness stories multiplied. Some claimed he was seen in Detroit, others in Kansas City or Omaha. The uncertainty only deepened fascination. Yet fame offered no safety. The same faces that idolized him would sell him to the Bureau for a price. The aftermath of Little Bohemia also unleashed Lester Nelson's fury. In the months that followed, his paranoia turned lethal. Believing agents were closing in, he ambushed patrolmen, robbed small banks alone, and left a trail of bodies from Illinois to Wisconsin. Hoover ordered his capture, by any means, pairing Cowley and Purvis for the task. Nelson's spree would end later that year, in a gunfight that killed both him and the agents who pursued him. But for now, his violence served as constant reminder of how dangerous Dillinger's circle remained. In the weeks after the raid, Dillinger vanished from public sight. Rumors placed him in Chicago, recovering with the help of sympathetic doctors who surgically altered his face to obscure recognition. The procedure, performed with crude anesthesia and crude instruments, left him scarred and swollen but alive. Photographs of his new appearance would later puzzle agents who searched for the familiar features of the man who had mocked them for months. Hoover's patience, already thin, hardened into obsession. He ordered constant surveillance on Chicago's underworld: safe houses, brothels, and gambling dens. Informants were promised money and protection in exchange for information. It was through one of these informants, a woman facing deportation, that the Bureau would finally locate Dillinger 3 months later. But in April 1934, that ending remained distant. The present was chaos. The Bureau counted casualties and revised procedures. Dillinger buried a friend and planned new disguises. Each side had been bloodied, neither victorious. The forests of Wisconsin were quiet again. The bullet holes in the lodge patched over. The tourists returning. Yet the echoes of that night lingered in the minds of every agent who had been there. For them, the war on crime had ceased to be a mission and become a personal reckoning. From the ashes of failure rose transformation. The Bureau learned to move faster, think broader, and strike harder. Dillinger learned that nowhere was safe, that every refuge carried betrayal, and that the myth sustaining him could not shield him forever. In the cold aftermath of Little Bohemia, both hunter and hunted understood the same truth. The next encounter would not end with escape. By the summer of 1934, John Dillinger had become both invisible and infamous. His name filled newspapers from coast to coast. His face stared out from post office walls. And his legend grew larger than the man who still walked among the living. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover used that legend to cement the Bureau's authority. In Chicago, Melvin Purvis used it to mobilize a city. But Dillinger himself had vanished into the quiet maze of back alleys and boarding houses, stripped of the arrogance that once carried him through daylight. The raid at Little Bohemia had burned away the illusion of control. He had escaped the bullets, but lost the core of his gang. John Hamilton lay dead in a shallow grave near Oswego, his wounds too deep to survive. Babyface Nelson had turned rogue, killing without cause. The others scattered, some arrested, some hiding under assumed names. Dillinger moved south to Chicago, wounded, exhausted, and desperate for transformation. The face on every wanted poster could no longer belong to him. He found a doctor through criminal contacts, a backroom physician known for altering faces of men who needed to disappear. In a cramped apartment above a barbershop, under the smell of ether and the faint buzz of streetcars, the operation began. There were no hospitals, no anesthesia beyond a bottle of whiskey. The doctor cut into his skin with a steady hand, reshaping cheekbones, trimming earlobes, burning fingertips to erase prints. The process lasted hours. Dillinger endured it in silence, gripping the chair until his knuckles whitened. When it was over, he looked into a mirror and saw not rebirth but ruin. The face was swollen, the eyes red-rimmed, the skin uneven, where acid had burned away ridges. He had become a shadow of himself, a man without identity, hunted by photographs that no longer matched the truth. For weeks he stayed hidden, recovering in rented rooms and moving between safe houses. The city outside was sweltering, its air thick with smoke and sweat. Chicago in July was a furnace of noise. Elevated trains rattling over steel rails, radios spilling dance music, and headlines shouting his name in every corner. Each morning's paper carried new theories. Dillinger sighted in Detroit. Dillinger dead in St. Louis. Dillinger robbing banks in Iowa. The lies worked in his favor, scattering the Bureau's resources. But anonymity was lonely, and Dillinger could not live on shadows alone. Through an old contact he met Polly Hamilton, a young waitress working in a Chicago tavern. She was naive to the weight of his past, drawn to the quiet confidence of the stranger, who called himself Jimmy Lawrence. For Dillinger she offered what he had not felt in years, a semblance of ordinary life. Together they moved into a small apartment on North Halsted Street, the kind of place no one remembered seeing. He spent his days indoors, reading newspapers, cleaning weapons, and staring from the window at the city that both hid and hunted him. It was through Polly that he met Anna Sage, a Romanian-born madam who ran a small brothel in the neighborhood. Her real name was Anna Campanas, and she lived under the shadow of deportation proceedings for her immigration status. To the Bureau of Investigation, she was already known, an undesirable alien facing removal. To Dillinger she was merely an acquaintance, the older friend of his companion. He could not have known that she would become the final link in his story. Anna had her own fears. The threat of deportation loomed over her life like a constant echo. When she learned that the man visiting Polly was John Dillinger, the same face that filled every newspaper, her instincts turned toward survival. On July 20th, 1934, she contacted a friend in the Chicago Police Department, offering information in exchange for protection from deportation. The message traveled swiftly through official channels until it reached Melvin Purvis. Purvis recognized the opportunity immediately. The Bureau's months of failure had hardened him, and this tip carried the scent of finality. He met Anna in secret, careful to verify every detail. She confirmed that Dillinger was living with Polly, and that they were planning an evening out that weekend. She did not know which theater they would choose, either the Biograph on Lincoln Avenue or the Marlboro on Madison, but promised to signal them when she knew. In return, she demanded two things: the $5,000 federal reward and help avoiding deportation. Purvis could promise only the first. He told her to wear a brightly colored dress, so she could be identified from a distance. She chose orange, though newspapers later called it red. While Purvis prepared, Hoover waited in Washington. The Bureau's failures at St. Paul and Little Bohemia still hung over him. He sent precise instructions. Dillinger must be taken alive if possible. But the safety of agents came first. He demanded that Purvis report directly by telephone, before any engagement. The director's obsession with control reached its height that week, as if every misstep of the past year could be corrected in one night. In the 2 days that followed, agents began shadowing Anna discreetly. She played her part with composure, pretending friendship while feeding information. On July 22nd, she called Purvis to confirm Dillinger, Polly, and she would attend the evening showing of Manhattan Melodrama at the Biograph Theater. The film's irony, a gangster doomed by loyalty, was not lost on anyone involved. Purvis mobilized at once. That Sunday evening was heavy with heat. Chicago shimmered under a setting sun, the streets humming with crowds, seeking relief in the theater's cool interiors. The Biograph, with its bright marquee and red brick facade, glowed like a lantern against the dimming sky. At 8:30 p.m., Anna Sage arrived with Polly and Dillinger. He wore a straw hat, tan suit, and gold-rimmed glasses, his new face still rough from the surgery. The disguise gave him confidence enough to walk openly past uniformed officers who failed to recognize him. The three purchased tickets and disappeared into the cool darkness of the theater. Outside, the Bureau encircled the block. Purvis divided his men into teams, positioning them at every exit. They numbered more than 20, armed with revolvers and submachine guns. The men blended into the crowds, some leaning against lampposts, others sitting in parked cars, pretending to read newspapers. The air was electric with anticipation. Every movement rehearsed, every angle measured. Purvis, standing across the street, watched the entrance through the rising haze of his cigar smoke. He did not move for nearly 2 hours. Inside, the film played to a packed house. Dillinger sat between the two women, his arm draped casually along the seatback. On screen, Clark Gable and William Powell delivered the story of loyalty, betrayal, and the inevitability of death. Dillinger watched without expression, though the themes mirrored his own fading empire. Around him, the audience laughed and sighed, unaware that the man seated among them was the most wanted fugitive in America. Outside, agents checked their weapons under the glow of streetlights. Sweat trickled down collars. Cars passed along Lincoln Avenue, their engines muffled by the pulse of the city. The theater doors spilled light each time someone stepped out for air, casting brief flashes across the waiting faces of the Bureau men. Every second extended into eternity. At 10:30 p.m., the film ended. The crowd began to rise, voices low and contented. Inside the lobby, Dillinger paused to adjust his hat, then stepped toward the exit, with the two women at his sides. He looked relaxed, unhurried, unaware that his name had already been whispered through the field radios outside. Purvis flicked his cigar to the ground, a signal. Across the street, engines turned over, and men began to move. The theater doors opened. Dillinger emerged into the humid night, laughing softly at something Polly said. The neon letters of the Biograph's marquee burned red and white above his head. To one side, Anna's orange dress caught the glow of a streetlight, the color unmistakable. Purvis tightened his jaw. The trap had closed. Dillinger led the women down the sidewalk, turning left toward the alley that ran beside the Carlton Theater building. Behind him, agents rose from their positions, closing in silently. Purvis stepped out from a doorway, watching the distance shrink. Everything unfolded in slow inevitability. The narrowing of steps, the breathless wait before recognition. Then, just before the corner, Dillinger's instinct surfaced. He glanced back, catching the faint movement of men where none should be. His hand dropped toward his pocket. Purvis gave the command. The street exploded into motion. But for now, in this moment suspended between calm and chaos, the theater still glowed behind him, the marquee letters humming against the night air. The audience dispersed, unaware that history waited just beyond the alley's mouth. Inside the Bureau cars, the agents' hands tightened around their weapons. Across the street, Anna Sage stood frozen beneath the light, her choice made, her fate sealed. And John Dillinger, unaware of the betrayal beside him, stepped into the darkness that had been waiting all along. The night pressed heavy on Lincoln Avenue, thick with the scent of street dust and gasoline. The Biograph Theater's neon sign glowed red and white against the dark sky, its reflection stretching across the wet pavement. Crowds spilled from the entrance, fanning onto the sidewalk with the casual murmur of summer conversation. Unseen among them, the Bureau's men waited, motionless, hidden in plain sight. Melvin Purvis stood across the street, in the shadows of a drugstore awning. The tip of his cigar burned faintly, as he drew a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the theater doors. The signal would come not from orders or words but from instinct. When the target appeared, when the moment aligned, when every failure that had preceded this night could be erased in a single act. Around him the agents were poised like drawn wire. Inside, the final minutes of Manhattan Melodrama faded into applause. Then, as the credits rolled, movement began. The lobby filled with voices, laughter, and the shuffle of departing footsteps. At precisely 10:30 p.m., John Dillinger stepped into the open air. He walked casually, flanked by Polly Hamilton on his left and Anna Sage on his right. The theater's lights painted their faces in alternating shades of gold and red. Dillinger adjusted his straw hat, unaware that half a dozen rifles were already trained in his direction. Purvis flicked his cigar to the ground. The ember fell, hissed against the pavement, and went dark. The men moved. From both ends of the block, agents began to close in, their coats concealing drawn pistols. They mingled briefly with the pedestrians, blending into the swirl of motion, until distance collapsed into proximity. Across the street, the sound of engines idled, waiting for the end of pursuit that had lasted nearly a year. Dillinger walked slowly, unhurried, his hand occasionally brushing the woman's arm beside him. He turned left at the corner, toward the narrow alley that ran alongside the Carlton Theater building. The air in the passage was cooler, shaded from the city's light. Halfway down, the street lamps thinned. His instinct, finely tuned by years of escape, caught something in the air. A stillness that did not belong. He hesitated, just enough for Purvis to see it. The agents advanced. Boots scuffed the pavement, low but unmistakable. Dillinger's head turned sharply. For a fraction of a second, his gaze met Purvis's. Across the dark gap of the alley mouth, recognition, calculation, and understanding compressed into a single glance. His right hand dropped toward his pocket. 3 men fired almost simultaneously. The alley erupted in thunder. Charles Winstead, Clarence Hurt, and Herman Hollis fired 5 shots in rapid succession. The muzzle flashes flared bright against the brick walls, echoing like cannon fire. The crowd scattered, screams rising above the roar of engines. Dillinger staggered backward, his hat tumbling from his head, one hand pressed to his chest. A bullet had entered just below his right eye, another through his side. He stumbled a few steps toward the curb, the momentum of life propelling him forward, even as it drained away. He reached the end of the alley, fell face down near the gutter, and did not rise. For a heartbeat, the city froze. Then chaos reclaimed it. Civilians ran in every direction. Some ducked behind cars, others pressed against storefronts. Purvis ordered his men to hold position, then crossed the street through the haze of gunpowder. Flashbulbs from reporters' cameras had already begun to strobe against the scene. The crowd, drawn by the noise, was swelling by the minute. Purvis knelt beside the body. The face was already slack, the blood pooling beneath it, dark and heavy. The disguise, the altered features, the dyed hair, had failed against the inevitability of recognition. Purvis studied the lifeless form that had eluded them for 11 months, the man whose name had built a federal empire. Around him, agents stood silent, their expressions unreadable. A call went out for a police wagon. Officers arrived within minutes, pushing through the growing mob. Some bystanders tried to reach the body. Others shouted for keepsakes, pieces of clothing, strands of hair. The myth of John Dillinger was already being divided among the living. When the stretcher arrived, Purvis stepped back, his coat sleeve brushing the brick still warm from muzzle flashes. The body was lifted, the head tilting loosely. As the weight settled, blood streaked the pavement. Under the theater's marquee, a shoe remained where it had fallen, glinting under the neon light. The clock in the drugstore window across the street read 10:50 p.m. They carried Dillinger's body to the nearby Alexian Brothers Hospital, where doctors confirmed what everyone already knew. The death certificate listed gunshot wounds to the chest and head. The time of death matched the moment when Lincoln Avenue had gone silent. Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered, hundreds, at first, then thousands. The story spread through the city like fire. Radios interrupted their programming to announce it. John Dillinger, public enemy number 1, shot and killed outside the Biograph Theater tonight. Across the country, people stopped what they were doing to listen. For some, it was justice. For others, the end of a legend. At the Bureau's Chicago office, Purvis telephoned Washington. J. Edgar Hoover answered personally. The conversation was brief, the words measured. When Purvis hung up, the silence in the room was heavier than triumph. Months of pursuit had ended in seconds. The Bureau had its victory, but it came with the weight of exhaustion, of men who had seen too much death to celebrate it. By midnight, The alley was a carnival of morbid curiosity. Reporters sketched the scene. Photographers documented every trace. Children pressed against barricades, trying to glimpse the spot where the outlaw had fallen. Souvenir hunters scraped blood from the pavement with handkerchiefs. The mythology of John Dillinger began not with his birth, nor his crimes, but with this aftermath, the transformation of flesh into symbol. At the hospital, agents removed his possessions: a .380 Colt automatic pistol, a pocket watch, loose bills, and a key ring. Each item was catalogued meticulously, as though order could erase chaos. Outside, the flash of cameras continued through the night. The morgue attendants, overwhelmed by requests from journalists, covered the windows with paper. In Washington, Hoover drafted his statement before dawn. It was restrained but triumphant, emphasizing the bravery of his agents and the cooperation between federal and local authorities. To the public, it read as closure. To Hoover, it was coronation. The Bureau of Investigation, once a small division within the Department of Justice, had proven its authority over state boundaries, its capacity for modern law enforcement. Dillinger's death was the foundation on which the Federal Bureau of Investigation would stand. But beneath the headlines, quieter stories lingered. Anna Sage, the woman in the orange dress, received her promised reward, but not her freedom. Despite Purvis's recommendation, the immigration authorities proceeded with her deportation. Her cooperation had bought her safety for a season, not a lifetime. She left America months later, carrying with her the knowledge that she had changed history and condemned herself in the same act. Polly Hamilton vanished into obscurity, protected by anonymity. Her connection to Dillinger was brief, accidental, and destined to be buried under his myth. She was questioned and released, her name fading from record within years. The agents who fired the fatal shots, Misted, Hurt, and Hollis, were commended by Hoover for courage and precision. They accepted the praise, but avoided the spotlight. None of them ever publicly confirmed which bullet ended Dillinger's life. The Bureau preferred it that way. Legends required mystery. By morning, the newspapers carried photographs of the body on the morgue table. His face pale, lips parted, eyes half closed under harsh fluorescent light. The same papers that had once printed his wanted posters now sold out within hours. Crowds formed outside morgues and police stations, demanding to see proof. In Indianapolis, his hometown, residents whispered disbelief that the boy from Oak Hill had ended in an alley on Lincoln Avenue. The body was transported to Crown Hill Cemetery, escorted by police cars through streets lined with silent onlookers. Hundreds gathered at the graveside. Some came out of curiosity, others from morbid respect. His father stood beside the coffin, expression unreadable. The lid closed softly, and the earth swallowed what was left of the man who had defied the nation's laws for less than 1 year, but altered its future for decades. For the Bureau, the victory was immediate and absolute. Hoover's press conferences framed the killing as the triumph of modern policing, the dawn of a new era of federal authority. The title, Public Enemy Number 1, was retired for Dillinger alone, a badge of infamy that no successor could quite match. Yet within the Bureau, men like Purvis understood the cost. The months of missteps, the blood spilled at Little Bohemia, the faces of agents lost along the way. The public saw precision. Those who lived it remembered chaos. In the weeks that followed, life on Lincoln Avenue returned to normal. The theater reopened, the marquee displaying new films to new crowds. The stains on the pavement faded beneath summer rain, but the stories remained. Residents spoke of seeing the flash of gunfire, of hearing the echo of that final chase. Some swore that the ghost of a man in a straw hat still walked the alley at night. Myth, once born, does not die with its subject. From that single evening, the balance of power in American crime shifted permanently. Dillinger's death ended the era of the romantic outlaw and began the reign of federal dominance. The Bureau, reborn from scandal and failure, would go on to chase new enemies with the methods perfected against him: surveillance, coordination, and the authority to cross any line in the name of justice. The modern manhunt had found its model in one man's defiance and demise. In the small hours before dawn, as the city finally quieted, a thin rain began to fall. It washed the last traces of blood from the alley stones, carrying them toward the gutter, where they mixed with oil and dirt before disappearing into the drains beneath the street. Above, the Biograph theater lights dimmed one by one, leaving only the faint red glow of the sign, letters flickering briefly before fading to darkness. The chase was over. The morning after the shooting, the nation awoke to headlines that declared an ending. Across the country, newspaper presses thundered before dawn, rolling out front pages drenched in triumph. Dillinger dead. The photographs were stark and unflinching. His lifeless face on a morgue table, his hat beside him, a tag looped around his wrist. Radios repeated the same words until they lost meaning. Their announcers describing the alley, the bullets, the straw hat, the crowd. For most Americans, it was the closing scene of an exhausting spectacle that had lasted less than 1 year but consumed the country's imagination. In the Department of Justice building in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover stood before a wall of reporters, the press conference arranged with theatrical precision. Behind him, a portrait of the president hung slightly off-center, the bureau's seal positioned at eye level for every camera. Hoover read from a prepared statement, his tone measured, his phrasing deliberate. He spoke of courage, coordination, and sacrifice, not of luck or chaos. The death of John Dillinger, he said, marked the triumph of federal law over lawlessness. Every word was designed to reshape perception, to turn confusion into order. By noon, his face appeared on every front page beside that of the outlaw he had hunted. The transformation was complete. Dillinger's death had elevated Hoover from bureaucrat to national figure. The Bureau of Investigation, once a small division mired in scandal and political interference, was reborn in the public mind as a force of precision and authority. Within months, its name would change to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a rebranding that symbolized permanence. The modern Federal Bureau of Investigation had been born in an alley on Lincoln Avenue. But beneath the polished narrative, the reality was less orderly. The Bureau's files from those days told a story of missteps, accidents, and internal rivalries. Field reports contradicted one another. Agents disagreed on who had fired first, who had fired last, who had fired at all. Some insisted Dillinger reached for his gun. Others doubted he had time. Hoover ignored the details. In his version, there was no confusion, only discipline and justice. The myth demanded clarity, and he gave it to the public with the certainty of a sermon. The agents returned to Chicago that week, their faces drawn and sleepless. Melvin Purvis, once the cautious strategist of St. Paul and Little Bohemia, became the reluctant hero of the hour. Reporters crowded outside his office, asking for statements, photographs, and details. He answered with restraint, offering nothing beyond what Hoover had approved. In private, he understood what the director's attention meant. Fame within the Bureau was never shared. It was borrowed and soon withdrawn. Still, for a moment, Purvis was the face of victory. Crowds greeted him on the streets. Newspapers called him the man who ended Dillinger's reign. In Washington, Hoover read the coverage with tightening patience. By autumn, Purvis's prominence had become an irritation. The director began quietly reassigning him, undermining his command with new layers of oversight. The man who had captured Hoover's greatest prize was soon a liability to the myth of Hoover himself. Within 1 year, Purvis resigned. The Bureau, however, continued to expand. Congress granted it greater jurisdiction, new funding, and broader authority to carry firearms. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Identification Division grew into the world's largest fingerprint archive. Training programs standardized investigation methods, transforming scattered field offices into coordinated arms of a national system. Agents learned marksmanship, forensic science, and psychological analysis. Every rule, every procedure, every policy traced its origin to the lessons of the Dillinger manhunt. The chaos of 1933 had evolved into structure by 1935. For Hoover, the timing was perfect. The country needed stability. The Depression had not ended, but Americans could find reassurance in the idea that crime could be conquered by method and discipline. The Bureau's public image became one of cleanliness and competence. Young men in suits, armed not only with guns, but with science. Dillinger, once the embodiment of daring rebellion, now served as the negative image against which federal virtue was measured. His death was no longer just a conclusion. It was propaganda. In Chicago, the public treated the event differently. Crowds visited the alley for weeks, tracing the bullet holes in the brick and whispering stories that grew with every retelling. Children played near the spot, adults spoke of omens, and street vendors sold photographs of the body to tourists. The fascination was not celebration, but awe, a recognition that something extraordinary had passed through their city and ended there. The line between criminal and legend blurred further with every retelling. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Dillinger gang were collapsing. Babyface Nelson, still at large, waged his own one-man war against the Bureau. He robbed banks, shot police officers, and taunted law enforcement by sending messages through intermediaries. Hoover placed him at the top of the wanted list, inheriting the title Public Enemy Number 1. The pursuit lasted several months, culminating on November 27, 1934, near Barrington, Illinois. There, Nelson engaged in a running gun battle with federal agents. When the smoke cleared, both sides lay dying. Special Agents Cowley and Hollis, veterans of the Dillinger chase, were dead. Nelson died shortly after, riddled with bullets, his defiance ending where Dillinger's had begun. The Bureau buried its losses with ceremony, Hoover attended the funerals, standing rigid in black, his expression unreadable. He spoke of sacrifice and national duty, weaving tragedy into the narrative of progress. The deaths of Cowley and Hollis balanced the scales, martyrs for order against the chaos that Dillinger had embodied. The myth tightened, polished by grief and victory alike. In the Midwest, the remnants of the outlaw era disappeared within 1 year. The Barker Carpus gang was dismantled. Ma Barker and her sons killed in Florida. Pretty Boy Floyd fell in a hail of bullets in Ohio. The country's fascination with armed desperados faded under the relentless march of federal efficiency. What had once seemed rebellion now appeared futility. The Gangster Era, which had begun with prohibition and desperation, ended in blood and bureaucracy. For Dillinger's family, the aftermath brought only emptiness. His father returned to his quiet farm in Mooresville, speaking rarely of his son. Visitors came for years, seeking souvenirs or stories. He turned most away. The grave at Crown Hill Cemetery became a pilgrimage site, flowers appearing each summer, photographs left by strangers who had never met the man they mourned. Some believed he had not died, that the body in the morgue was someone else. Rumors claimed he had escaped, changed again, and fled the country. The Bureau dismissed such tales, but they endured. Myths do not answer to evidence. By 1935, the transformation of the Bureau was complete. New headquarters rose in Washington, its marble halls filled with the rhythm of typewriters and the hum of telephones. The fingerprints of millions were filed, cross-indexed, and stored in vast cabinets under steel lamps. Hoover's office overlooked the city like a command post. The director's reputation, once precarious, was now untouchable. He had built his legacy on the corpse of one man, and the nation rewarded him with permanence. Yet among his own ranks, the human cost lingered. Purvis, removed from command, returned to private law practice. Reporters still followed him for a time, asking about Dillinger, about Hoover, about the night outside the Biograph. His answers grew shorter each year. He never denied the role he played, but neither did he claim ownership of the moment. His relationship with the Bureau faded into silence, then bitterness. In 1960, long after the public had forgotten his name, he died by his own hand, a pistol beside him, the same weapon issued by the Bureau he had once served. The legend of John Dillinger survived long after the man. Hollywood found him irresistible. The bank robber, who smiled for cameras, who outwitted sheriffs with wooden guns, who treated crime as performance. Films turned him into archetype, novels into metaphor. He became less a person than an idea, the defiant figure who stood against systems too large to comprehend. In Depression-era memory, he represented something beyond crime, a symbol of independence in a world of failure. The same public that cheered his death continued to resurrect him in song and story. The Bureau, for its part, controlled the narrative tightly. Hoover allowed public fascination, but filtered history through the lens of order. Museums displayed confiscated weapons, bulletproof vests, and wanted posters. Each artifact was labeled, not as a relic of rebellion, but as proof of progress. Dillinger's story was not buried. It was curated. The message was clear. Law always triumphs, and those who defy it become tools of their own undoing. Still, the human truth remained more complex. Dillinger had been clever, reckless, and brutal, but also disciplined in his own strange way, a product of poverty, punishment, and the country that had created him. His life traced the thin line between opportunity and desperation, between ambition and ruin. For the Bureau, he was the enemy that justified its creation. For the public, he was the mirror they preferred not to recognize. As 1935 dawned, Hoover addressed Congress to celebrate the Bureau's new status. His speech was triumphant, but careful. Each sentence, a brick in the edifice of national memory. He praised his agents, honored the fallen, and promised an era of scientific law enforcement. The chamber applauded. Outside, the world moved on. New crimes, new wars, new fears, yet the foundation remained, built on the pursuit that had begun with a single jailbreak and ended in an alley outside a theater. The story of John Dillinger closed, but its echoes shaped everything that followed. The Bureau's authority expanded into every corner of the nation. Surveillance became routine, coordination standard, jurisdiction unlimited. The lessons learned in chasing one man were applied to thousands. The federal government had found its modern face, and it wore the calm precision Hoover demanded. In the years that followed, agents who had once hunted Dillinger retired quietly, their names fading from public memory. The alley on Lincoln Avenue changed, its buildings replaced, its pavement resurfaced, yet the spot where he fell remained etched in history, a crossroads between myth and machinery, between the outlaw and the institution that rose to defeat him. And as the decade turned, with the Depression slowly giving way to recovery, America looked back on the era of gangsters as if it had been another lifetime. A brief, violent dream that ended in the flash of gunfire beneath the marquee lights of the Biograph. Decades passed, and the light from the Biograph's marquee dimmed into history. The alley where John Dillinger fell was repaved, the brick walls patched and repainted, the neon glow replaced by modern glass and chrome. Yet the story refused to fade. It clung to the American imagination like smoke, reshaping itself with each retelling, each generation finding in him a reflection of its own discontent. In the years after 1934, the United States changed. The Great Depression ebbed into war, and the war reshaped the nation into something vast and disciplined, an empire of law, production, and surveillance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, born in blood and headlines, became a fixture of that order. Its agents multiplied, its budget swelled, its reach extended into every state and city. Fingerprint files turned into archives the size of buildings. Wiretaps replaced whispers. Dossiers replaced guesswork. What had once been a desperate pursuit across state lines became an institution that defined authority itself. J. Edgar Hoover ruled over it for nearly half a century. He built his bureau into a fortress of secrecy and image. Its agents drilled in the uniform precision he demanded. White shirts, dark suits, unflinching discipline. The memory of Dillinger remained both victory and warning, the cautionary legend Hoover invoked whenever defiance threatened control. To him, Dillinger was not just a criminal. He was the reason for the Bureau's existence, the argument for every new power, claimed in the name of national security. The photographs from Lincoln Avenue hung in the archives as proof that order could conquer chaos. Publicly, Hoover grew into a national symbol. Presidents came and went. Hoover stayed. Under his direction, the Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its reach into espionage, counterintelligence, and political surveillance. Files were kept on activists, senators, and even presidents. Behind the polished image of efficiency lay fear, of exposure, of scrutiny, of losing the myth that had begun with Dillinger's death. When Hoover finally died in 1972, the files he left behind filled entire floors, a paper monument to obsession. Melvin Purvis, who had stood in the alley that night, did not live to see that empire's full rise. His fame faded quickly. After leaving the Bureau, he married, practiced law, and tried to forget the years defined by pursuit. Yet the past lingered. Journalists continued to call him the man who got Dillinger, as if no other life existed. Hoover's quiet campaign to erase him from official credit succeeded. His name disappeared from Bureau publications, his image omitted from exhibits. By the time of his death in 1960, the man once hailed as hero had become a ghost of his own accomplishment. The pistol found beside him, the same model issued by the Bureau, was a bitter symbol of the system that had both used and discarded him. Anna Sage, the woman in the orange dress, never escaped the shadow of her choice. Deported to Romania, despite her cooperation, she lived her final years in obscurity and poverty. To the world, she was remembered not as Anna Campanas, but as the woman in red, a miscoloring that became permanent. In Chicago folklore, she was alternately saint and traitor, the immigrant who brought down a legend, or the woman who sold a man for survival. Her grave in Timisoara remains unmarked. Lester Babyface Nelson died only months after Dillinger, his death sealing the final page of that violent generation. Others followed in quieter ways. Harry Pierpont and Charles Mackley, executed for the murder of Sheriff Sarber, met the electric chair without ceremony. The remaining members of the gang vanished into prisons or nameless small towns. What had once been a network of fear across the Midwest became a footnote. The country had moved on to newer enemies. Foreign spies, saboteurs, communists. The era of the outlaw was over. Yet Dillinger himself refused to vanish. His name endured, carried in whispers, in songs, in film. Hollywood rediscovered him again and again, first in cheap crime serials, later in grand productions that turned history into myth. He became a symbol, reshaped to fit each decade's hunger. In the 1940s, the reckless youth. In the 1960s, the anti-establishment rebel. In later years, the misunderstood man, trapped by circumstance. Every generation created its own Dillinger, each version more distant from the truth. The truth was simpler, smaller, and more human. He had been clever, yes, but not invincible. Disciplined, but not noble. He lived on the margins of a society, collapsing under its own weight. And for a moment, he moved faster than it could catch him. His robberies were not revolutions. They were escapes, brief acts of defiance against a world that had given him little else. He hurt people, frightened them, and left bodies behind. Yet somehow, in dying, he became the figure his living self never was. A symbol of freedom in a land obsessed with control. Writers and scholars would later argue that Dillinger's appeal lay not in his crimes, but in his context. America in the 1930s was a country suffocating under failure, banks collapsing, families displaced, hope rationed, like bread. When he robbed a bank, he seemed to strike at the very institutions that had failed everyone else. The fact that he smiled for photographers, that he carried himself with grace instead of rage, turned criminality into performance. He gave people a story at a time when stories were all they had. The Bureau won the war, but Dillinger won the narrative. In Indianapolis, his grave became a quiet landmark. Tourists left coins, flowers, and notes written in fading pencil. Some chipped pieces from the headstone until the family replaced it with thicker concrete. A few claimed to see the outline of a face in the stone on humid nights, as if the man himself refused to stay buried. Decades later, the cemetery installed additional measures to protect the site, not from vandals, but from devotion. For historians, the Dillinger case marked the turning point between two Americas, one defined by local lawmen and newspapers, and another ruled by federal systems and mass media. His pursuit created the blueprint for national coordination, fingerprint databases, and the very concept of a centralized investigative agency. The Bureau learned from every mistake it made, chasing him. And in doing so, it became something far larger than its quarry. The modern surveillance state began with one outlaw, and one director obsessed with controlling how the story would end. The tension between the man and the machine, between individual rebellion and institutional power, became the enduring theme of the century that followed. Artists, filmmakers, and musicians returned to it endlessly. The lone figure running against the tide, the system closing in. In those retellings, Dillinger was never just a criminal. He was the mythic shadow cast by the light of order. By the time Hoover's Bureau reached its zenith in the 1950s, America no longer feared men with Tommy guns. It feared invisible ones with dossiers and files. The outlaw of the Depression had given way to the bureaucrat of the Cold War. Yet even in that world of conformity and suspicion, Dillinger's ghost lingered as a reminder that no empire of control is ever absolute. His story whispered from posters and films, from songs played in smoky bars, from the mouths of those who dreamed, just for a moment, of stepping outside the rules. In the quiet corners of the archives in Washington, the original case files remain. They are precise and impersonal, typed reports, mugshots, ballistics charts, lists of evidence. The handwriting of the agents still marks the margins. Subject likely headed north. Suspect sighted near Hammond. Positive ID. There is no glamour there, only the rhythm of bureaucracy documenting chaos. Yet within those pages lies the pulse of the story that built the modern Federal Bureau of Investigation. The first fingerprint cards, tagged with red metal, the telegrams from Purvis, the autopsy report signed in black ink, all pieces of the machinery that turned one man's death into institutional immortality. Outside those archives, the myth lives differently. On anniversaries, crowds still gather at the Biograph Theater. The building has changed hands many times, but its facade remains the same. Visitors pose in the alley, standing where the gunfire once echoed, their photographs capturing the same angle where history turned. Some leave flowers, others coins. A few just silence. The neon lights, restored for nostalgia, flicker each evening as they did that night in July 1934, casting a red hue across the sidewalk where it ended. 80 years later, his story still divides America. To some, Dillinger was a violent thief who deserved his fate. To others, he was a symbol of independence in a country learning the price of obedience. Both views are true in their own way, for both belong to the same nation that built him and destroyed him. The world he knew no longer exists. The banks he robbed became digital. The weapons he carried relics. The roads he escaped down covered now by highways and surveillance cameras. Yet even in an age where every movement can be traced, the myth of escape endures. Dillinger's life, brief, chaotic and doomed, reminds the modern world of something it quietly fears, that systems can be challenged, that the individual still matters, even in failure. When the last of the agents who had known him died, their memories passed into history, and the photographs became the only witnesses. In them, Dillinger is always young, always confident, always moments away from the fate waiting outside a theater door. Time could not move him. Beyond that instant, the Bureau aged, the country changed, the world learned new forms of power, but he remained frozen in that frame. Straw hat tilted, faint smile intact, stepping into legend. If there is a lesson in his story, it lies not in crime or punishment, but in the mirror it holds to the country that made him. America has always balanced its identity between freedom and control, between myth and order. Dillinger lived at the fault line where those forces collided. He lost, as all who defy institutions eventually do. But in losing, he revealed the shape of what was coming. A century where every act of rebellion would be both condemned and immortalized. The alley on Lincoln Avenue still exists, narrower now, caught between new buildings and old ghosts. At night, When the wind passes through, and the city quiets, the sound is almost like the whisper of tires on distant pavement. For a moment, it feels as if somewhere out there an engine starts, a door slams, and a man with a worn coat and restless eyes looks once more toward freedom he will never reach. Then the echo fades, and the light from the theater flickers out, and all that remains is the shadow that stayed.